that you must be always examining yourself to see how many rules you had broken, the back of the card began like this. Rule 1. Put the whole thing out of your head the moment you get into bed. Or again, whereas the front said that you must always go and ask your elders what the rule about a certain thing was, if you were in the least doubt, the back said, Rule 2. Unless they saw you do it, keep quiet, or else you'll rue it. And so on. And now I dreamed that John went out one morning and tried to play in the road and to forget his troubles. But the rules kept coming back into his head, so that he did not make much of it. However, he went on always a few yards further, till suddenly he looked up and saw that he was so far away from home that he was in a part of the road he had never seen before. The Pilgrims Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism, by C.S. Lewis. The book bears a dedication to Arthur Greaves. As cold waters to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. Proverbs. Book 1. The Data. This every soul seeketh, and for the sake of this doth all her actions, having an inkling that it is, but what it is she cannot sufficiently discern, and she knoweth not her way, and concerning this she hath no constant assurance as she hath of other things. Plato. Whose souls, albeit in a cloudy memory, yet seek back their good, but like drunk men know not the road home. Boethius. Somewhat it seeketh, and what that is directly it knoweth not. Yet very intentive desire thereof doth so incite it, that all other known delights and pleasures are laid aside. They give place to the search of this, but only suspected desire. Hooker. 1. The Rules. I dreamed of a boy who was born in the land of Puritania, and his name was John. And I dreamed that when John was able to walk, he ran out of his parents' garden on a fine morning onto the road. And on the other side of the road there was a deep wood, but not thick, full of primroses and soft green moss. When John set eyes on this, he thought he had never seen anything so beautiful, and he ran across the road and into the wood, and was just about to go down on his hands and knees and to pull up the primroses by handfuls, when his mother came running out of the garden gate, and she also ran across the road and caught John up and smacked him soundly and told him he must never go into the wood again. And John cried, but he asked no questions, for he was not yet at the age for asking questions. Then a year went past, and then another fine morning John had a little sling, and he went out into the garden, and he saw a bird sitting on a branch. And John got his sling ready and was going to have a shot at the bird when the cook came running out of the garden and caught John up and smacked him soundly and told him he must never kill any of the birds in the garden. Why? Said John. Because the steward would be very angry, said cook. Who is the steward? Said John. He is the man who makes rules for all the country round here, said cook. Why? Said John. Because the landlord set him to do it. Who is the landlord? Said John. He owns all the country, said the cook. Why? Said John. And when he asked this, the cook went and told his mother. And his mother sat down and talked to John about the landlord all afternoon. But John took none of it in, for he was not yet at the age for taking it in. Then a year went past, and one dark, cold, wet morning John was made to put on new clothes. They were the ugliest clothes that had ever been put upon him, which John did not mind at all, but they also caught him under the chin, and were tight under the arms, which he minded a great deal, and they made him itch all over. And his father and mother took him out along the road, one holding him by each hand, which was uncomfortable too, and very unnecessary, and told him they were taking him to see the steward. The steward lived in a big dark house of stone on the side of the road. The father and mother went in to talk to the steward first, and John was left sitting in the hall on a chair so high that his feet did not reach the floor. There were other chairs in the hall where he could have sat in comfort, but his father had told him that the steward would be angry if he did not sit absolutely still and be very good. And John was beginning to be afraid. So he sat still in the high chair with his feet dangling, and his clothes itching all over him, and his eyes starting out of his head. After a very long time, his parents came back again, looking as if they had been with the doctor, very grave. Then they said that John must go in and see the steward too. And when John came into the room, there was an old man with a red, round face who was very kind and full of jokes, so that John quite got over his fears, and they had a good talk about fishing tackle and bicycles. But just when the talk was at its best, the steward got up and cleared his throat. He then took down a mask from the wall with a long white beard attached to it, and suddenly clapped it on his face, so that his appearance was awful. And he said, "Now I'm going to talk to you about the landlord. The landlord owns all the country, and it is very, very kind of him to allow us to live on in it at all. Very, very kind." He went on repeating, "very kind," in a queer sing-song voice, so long that John would have laughed. But now he was beginning to be frightened again. The steward then took down from a peg a big card with small print all over it, and said, "Here is a list of all the things the landlord says you must not do. You'd better look at it." So John took the card. But half the rules seemed to forbid things he had never heard of, and the other half forbade things he was doing every day and could not imagine not doing. And a number of the rules were so enormous that he felt he could never remember them all. "I hope," said the steward, "that you have not already broken any of the rules." John's heart began to thump, and his eyes bulged more and more, and he was at his wits' end when the steward took the mask off and looked at John with his real face and said, "Better tell a lie, old chap, better tell a lie. Easiest for all concerned," and popped the mask on his face all in a flash. John gulped and said quickly, "Oh, no, sir." "That is just as well," said the steward through the mask, "because, you know, if you did break any of them and the landlord got to know of it, do you know what he'd do to you?" "No, sir," said John. And the steward's eyes seemed to be twinkling dreadfully through the holes of the mask. "He'd take you and shut you up for ever and ever in a black hole full of snakes and scorpions as large as lobsters, for ever and ever. And besides that, he is such a kind, good man, so very, very kind, that I am sure you would never want to displease him." "No, sir," said John, "but please, sir." "Well," said the steward. "Please, sir, supposing I did break one little one, just by accident, you know, could nothing stop the snakes and lobsters?" "Ah," said the steward. And then he sat down and talked for a long time, but John could not understand a single syllable. However, it all ended with pointing out that the landlord was quite extraordinarily kind and good to his tenants, and would certainly torture most of them to death the moment he had the slightest pretext. "And you can't blame him," said the steward, "for after all, it is his land, and it is so very good of him to let us live here at all, people like us, you know." Then the steward took off the mask and had a nice, sensible chat with John again, and gave him a cake and brought him out to his father and mother. But just as they were going, he bent down and whispered in John's ear, "I shouldn't bother about it all too much if I were you." At the same time, he slipped the card of rules into John's hand and told him he could keep it for his own use. 2. The Island. Now the days and the weeks went on again, and I dreamed that John had little peace either by day or night for thinking of the rules and the black hole full of snakes. At first he tried very hard to keep them all, but when it came to bedtime he always found that he had broken far more than he had kept, and the thought of the horrible tortures to which the good, kind landlord would put him became such a burden that next day he would become quite reckless and break as many as he possibly could. For oddly enough, this eased his mind for the moment. But then, after a few days, the fear would return, and this time it would be worse than before because of the dreadful number of rules that he had broken during the interval. But what puzzled him most at this time was a discovery which he made after the rules had been hanging in his bedroom for 2 or 3 nights. Namely, that on the other side of the card, on the back, there was quite a different set of rules. There were so many that he never read them all through, and he was always finding new ones. Some of them were very like the rules on the front of the card, but most of them were just the opposite. Thus, whereas the front of the card said that you must be always examining yourself to see how many rules you had broken, the back of the card began like this. Rule 1. Put the whole thing out of your head the moment you get into bed. Or again, whereas the front said that you must always go and ask your elders what the rule about a certain thing was, if you were in the least doubt, the back said, Rule 2, unless they saw you do it, keep quiet, or else you'll rue it, and so on. And now I dreamed that John went out one morning and tried to play in the road and to forget his troubles, but the rules kept coming back into his head, so that he did not make much of it. However, he went on always a few yards further, till suddenly he looked up and saw that he was so far away from home that he was in a part of the road he had never seen before. Then came the sound of a musical instrument. From behind, it seemed, very sweet and very short, as if it were one plucking of a string or one note of a bell, and after it a full, clear voice. And it sounded so high and strange that he thought it was very far away, further than a star. The voice said, Come. Then John saw that there was a stone wall beside the road in that part, but it had, what he had never seen in a garden wall before, a window. There was no glass in the window, and no bars. It was just a square hole in the wall. Through it he saw a green wood full of primroses, and he remembered suddenly how he had gone into another wood to pull primroses as a child very long ago, so long that even in the moment of remembering, the memory seemed still out of reach. While he strained to grasp it, there came to him from beyond the wood a sweetness and a pang so piercing that instantly he forgot his father's house, and his mother, and the fear of the landlord, and the burden of the rules. All the furniture of his mind was taken away. A moment later he found that he was sobbing, and the sun had gone in, and what it was that had happened to him he could not quite remember, nor whether it had happened in this wood or in the other wood when he was a child. It seemed to him that a mist which hung at the far end of the wood had parted for a moment, and through the rift he had seen a calm sea, and in the sea an island where the smooth turf sloped down unbroken to the bays, and out of the thickets peeped the pale, small-breasted Oreads, wise like gods, unconscious of themselves like beasts, and tall enchanters, bearded to their feet, sat in green chairs among the forests. But even while he pictured these things, he knew, with one part of his mind, that they were not like the things he had seen. Nay, that what had befallen him was not seeing at all. But he was too young to heed the distinction, and too empty, now that the unbounded sweetness passed away, not to seize greedily whatever it had left behind. He had no inclination yet to go into the wood, and presently he went home with a sad excitement upon him, repeating to himself 1,000 times, I know now what I want. The first time that he said it, he was aware that it was not entirely true, but before he went to bed, he was believing it. 3. The Eastern Mountains. John had a disreputable old uncle who was the tenant of a poor little farm beside his father's. One day when John came in from the garden, he found a great hubbub in the house. His uncle was sitting there with his cheeks the colour of ashes. His mother was crying. His father was sitting very still, with a solemn face, and there in the midst of them was the steward with his mask on. John crept round to his mother and asked her what the matter was. Poor Uncle George has had notice to quit, she said. Why? Said John. His lease is up. The landlord has sent him notice to quit. But didn't you know how long the lease was for? Oh, no. Indeed we did not. We thought it was for years and years more. I'm sure the landlord never gave us any idea he was going to turn him out at a moment's notice like this. Ah, but it doesn't need any notice, broke in the steward. You know he always retains the right to turn anyone out whenever he chooses. It is very good of him to let any of us stay here at all. To be sure, said the mother. That goes without saying, said the father. I'm not complaining, said Uncle George, but it seems cruelly hard. Not at all, said the steward. You've only got to go to the castle and knock at the gate and see the landlord himself. You know that he's only turning you out of here to make you much more comfortable somewhere else, don't you? Uncle George nodded. He did not seem able to get his voice. Suddenly the father looked at his watch. Then he looked up at the steward and said, Well? Yes, said the steward. Then John was sent up to his bedroom and told to put on the ugly and uncomfortable clothes, and when he came downstairs, itching all over and tight under the arms, he was given a little mask to put on, and his parents put masks on too. Then I thought in my dream that they wanted to put a mask on Uncle George, but he was trembling so that it would not stay on. So they had to see his face as it was. And his face became so dreadful that everyone looked in a different direction and pretended not to see it. They got Uncle George to his feet with much difficulty, and then they all came out onto the road. The sun was just setting at one end of the road, for the road ran east and west. They turned their backs on the dazzling western sky, and there John saw ahead of them the night coming down over the eastern mountains. The country sloped down eastward to a brook, and all this side of the brook was green and cultivated. On the other side of the brook a great black moor sloped upward, and beyond that were the crags and chasms of the lower mountains, and high above them again the bigger mountains, and on top of the whole waste was one mountain so big and black that John was afraid of it. He was told that the landlord had his castle up there. They trudged on eastward a long time, always descending, till they came to the brook. They were so low that the sunset behind them was out of sight. Before them all was growing darker every minute, and the cold east wind was blowing out of the darkness right from the mountain tops. When they had stood for a little, Uncle George looked round on them all once or twice and said, "Oh dear, oh dear," in a funny small voice like a child's. Then he stepped over the brook and began to walk away up the moor. It was now so dark, and there were so many ups and downs in the moorland, that they lost sight of him almost at once. Nobody ever saw him again. "Well," said the steward, untying his mask as they turned homeward, "we've all got to go when our time comes." "That's true," said the father, who was lighting his pipe. When it was lit, he turned to the steward and said, "Some of those pigs of George's have won prizes." "I'd keep 'em if I were you," said the steward. "It's no time for selling now." "Perhaps you're right," said the father. John walked behind with his mother.
"Mother? Well, dear? Could any of us be turned out without notice like that any day?" "Well, yes, but it is very unlikely." "But we might be." "You oughtn't to be thinking of that sort of thing at your age." "Why oughtn't I?" "It's not healthy, a boy like you." "Mother?" "Yes?" "Can we break off the lease without notice, too?" "How do you mean?" "Well, the landlord can turn us out of the farm whenever he likes. Can we leave the farm whenever we like?" "No, certainly not." "Why not?" "That's in the lease. We must go when he likes and stay as long as he likes." "Why?" "I suppose because he makes the leases." "What would happen if we did leave?" "He would be very angry." "Would he put us in the black hole?" "Perhaps." "Mother?" "Well, dear?" "Will the landlord put Uncle George in the black hole?" "How dare you say such a thing about your poor uncle? Of course he won't." "But hasn't Uncle George broken all the rules?" "Broken all the rules? Your Uncle George was a very good man." "You never told me that before," said John. 4. Leah for Rachel. Then I turned over in my sleep and began to dream deeper still. And I dreamed that I saw John growing tall and lank, till he ceased to be a child and became a boy. The chief pleasure of his life in these days was to go down the road and look through the window in the wall in the hope of seeing the beautiful island. Some days he saw it well enough, especially at first, and heard the music and the voice. At first he would not look through the window into the wood unless he had heard the music, but after a time both the sight of the island and the sounds became very rare. He would stand looking through the window for hours and seeing the wood, but no sea or island beyond it, and straining his ears but hearing nothing except the wind in the leaves. And the yearning for that sight of the island and the sweet wind blowing over the water from it, though indeed these themselves had given him only yearning, became so terrible that John thought he would die if he did not have them again soon. He even said to himself, "I would break every rule on the card for them if I could only get them. I would go down to the black hole forever if it had a window from which I could see the island." Then it came into his head that perhaps he ought to explore the wood, and thus he might find his way down to the sea beyond it. So he determined that the next day, whatever he saw or heard at the window, he would go through, and spend the whole day in the wood. When the morning came, it had been raining all night, and a south wind had blown the clouds away at sunrise, and all was fresh and shining. As soon as he had had his breakfast, John was out on the road.
With the wind and the birds and country carts passing, there were many noises about that morning, so that when John heard a strain of music long before he had reached the wall and the window, a strain like that which he desired, but coming from an unexpected quarter, he could not be absolutely certain that he had not imagined it. It made him stand still in the road for a minute, and in my dream I could hear him thinking, like this: if I go after that sound, away off the road up yonder, it is all luck whether I shall find anything at all. But if I go to the window, there I know I shall reach the wood, and there I can have a good hunt for the shore and the island. In fact, I shall insist on finding it. I am determined to. But if I go a new way, I shall not be able to insist. I shall just have to take what comes. So he went on to the place he knew, and climbed through the window into the wood. Up and down and to and fro among the trees he walked, looking this way and that, but he found no sea and no shore, and indeed no end to the wood in any direction. When it came to the middle of the day, he was so hot that he sat down and fanned himself. Often of late, when the sight of the island had been withheld, he had felt sad and despairing, but what he felt now was more like anger. I must have it, he kept on saying to himself, and then, I must have something. Then it occurred to him that at least he had the wood, which he would once have loved, and that he had not given it a thought all morning. Very well, thought John, I will enjoy the wood. I will enjoy it. He set his teeth and wrinkled his forehead, and sat still until the sweat rolled off him in an effort to enjoy the wood. But the more he tried, the more he felt that there was nothing to enjoy. There was the grass, and there were the trees. But what am I to do with them? Said John. Next it came into his head that he might perhaps get the old feeling. For what, he thought, had the island ever given him but a feeling? By imagining. He shut his eyes and set his teeth again and made a picture of the island in his mind, but he could not keep his attention on the picture because he wanted all the time to watch some other part of his mind to see if the feeling were beginning. But no feeling began, and then, just as he was opening his eyes, he heard a voice speaking to him. It was quite close at hand, and very sweet, and not at all like the old voice of the wood. When he looked round, he saw what he had never expected, yet he was not surprised. There, in the grass beside him, sat a laughing brown girl of about his own age, and she had no clothes on. "It was me you wanted," said the brown girl. "I am better than your silly islands." And John rose and caught her in all haste, and committed fornication with her in the wood. 5. Ichabod. After that, John was always going to the wood. He did not always have his pleasure of her in the body, though it often ended that way. Sometimes he would talk to her about himself, telling her lies about his courage and his cleverness. All that he told her she remembered, so that on other days she could tell it over to him again. Sometimes even he would go with her through the wood looking for the sea and the island, but not often. Meanwhile the year went on, and the leaves began to fall in the wood, and the skies were more often grey, until now, as I dreamed, John had slept in the wood, and he woke up in the wood. The sun was low, and a blustering wind was stripping the leaves from the branches. The girl was still there, and the appearance of her was hateful to John, and he saw that she knew this, and the more she knew it, the more she stared at him, smiling. He looked round and saw how small the wood was after all, a beggarly strip of trees between the road and a field that he knew well. Nowhere in sight was there anything that he liked at all. "I shall not come back here," said John. "What I wanted is not here. It wasn't you I wanted, you know." "Wasn't it?" said the brown girl. "Then be off, but you must take your family with you." With that she put up her hands to her mouth and called. Instantly, from behind every tree, there slipped out a brown girl. Each of them was just like herself. The little wood was full of them. "What are these?" "Our daughters," said she. "Did you not know you were a father? Did you think I was barren, you fool? And now, children," she added, turning to the mob, "go with your father." Suddenly John became very much afraid, and leapt over the wall into the road. There he ran home as fast as he could. 6. Quem queritis in sepulchro, non est hic. From that day forth, until he left his home, John was not happy. First of all, the weight of all the rules that he had broken descended upon him. For while he was going daily to the wood, he had almost forgotten the landlord, and now suddenly the whole reckoning was to pay. In the second place, his last sight of the island was now so long ago that he had forgotten how to wish for it even, and almost how to set about looking for it. At first he feared to go back to the window in the wall, lest he should meet the brown girl, but he soon found that her family were so constantly with him that place made no difference. Wherever he sat down to rest on a walk, there, sooner or later, there would be a little brown girl beside him. When he sat of an evening with his father and mother, a brown girl, visible only to him, would sidle in and sit at his feet. And sometimes his mother would fix her eyes on him and even ask him what he was staring at. But most of all they plagued him whenever he had a fit of fright about the landlord and the black hole. It was always the same. He would wake one morning full of fear and take down his card and read it, the front of it, and determine that today he would really begin to keep the rules. And for that day he would. But the strain was intolerable. He used to comfort himself by saying, "It will get more easy as I go on. Tomorrow it will be easier." But tomorrow was always harder. And on the third day it was worst of all. And on that third day, when he crept away to bed, tired to death and raw in his soul, always he would be sure to find a brown girl waiting for him there, and on such a night he had no spirit to resist her blandishments. But when he perceived that no place was more or less haunted than another, then he came sidling back to the window in the wall. He had little hopes of it. He visited it more as a man visits a grave. It was full winter now, and the grove was naked and dark. The trees dripped in it, and the stream, he saw now that it was little more than a gutter, was full of dead leaves and mud. The wall, too, was broken where he had jumped over it. Yet John stood there a long time, many a winter evening, looking in, and he seemed to himself to have reached the bottom of misery. One night he was trudging home from it when he began to weep. He thought of that first day when he had heard the music and seen the island, and the longing, not now for the island itself, but for that moment when he had so sweetly longed for it, began to swell up in a warm wave, sweeter, sweeter, till he thought he could bear no more, and then yet sweeter again, till on the top of it, unmistakably, there came the short sound of music, as if a string had been plucked or a bell struck once. At the same moment, a coach had gone past him. He turned and looked after it, in time to see a head, even then being withdrawn from the window, and he thought he heard a voice say, "Come." And far beyond the coach, among the hills of the western horizon, he thought that he saw a shining sea, and a faint shape of an island, not much more than a cloud. It was nothing compared with what he had seen the first time. It was so much further away. But his mind was made up. That night he waited till his parents were asleep, and then, putting some few needments together, he stole out by the back door and set his face to the west to seek for the island. Book 2. Thrill. Thou shalt not make to thyself any graven image, nor the likeness of anything that is in the heaven above. Exodus. The soul of man, therefore, desiring to learn what manner of things these are, casteth her eyes upon objects akin to herself, whereof none sufficeth. And then it is that she saith, With the Lord, and with the things whereof I spoke, there is nothing in that likeness. What then is it like? This is the question, O son of Dionysus, that is the cause of all evils, or rather the travail wherein the soul travaileth about it. Plato, though some think it wrongly attributed to him. Following false copies of the good, that no sincere fulfilment of their promise make. Dante. In hand she boldly took to make another like the former dame, another Florimel in shape and look, so lively and so like that many it mistook. Spenser. 1. Dixit incipiens. Still I lay dreaming in bed and looked, and I saw John go plodding along the road westward in the bitter black of a frosty night. He walked so long that the morning broke. Then presently John saw a little inn by the side of the road, and a woman with a broom, who had opened the door and was sweeping out the rubbish. So he turned in there and called for a breakfast. And while it was cooking, he sat down in a hard chair by the newly lit fire and fell asleep. When he woke, the sun was shining through the window, and there was his breakfast laid. Another traveller was already eating. He was a big man, with red hair and a red stubble on all his 3 chins, buttoned up very tight. When they had both finished, the traveller rose and cleared his throat and stood with his back to the fire. Then he cleared his throat again and said, "A fine morning, young sir." "Yes, sir," said John.
"You are going west, perhaps, young man?"
I think so."
"It is possible that you don't know me."
"I am a stranger here."
"No offence," said the stranger. "My name is Mr. Enlightenment, and I believe it is pretty generally known. I shall be happy to give you my assistance and protection as far as our ways lie together."
John thanked him very much for this, and when they went out from the inn, there was a neat little trap waiting, with a fat little pony between the shafts, and its eyes were so bright and its harness was so well polished that it was difficult to say which was twinkling the keener in the morning sunshine. They both got into the trap, and Mr. Enlightenment whipped up the fat little pony, and they went bowling along the road as if nobody had a care in the world. Presently they began to talk.
"And where might you come from, my fine lad?"
said Mr. Enlightenment. "From Puritania, sir," said John.
"A good place to leave, eh?"
"I'm so glad you think that," cried John. "I was afraid—"
"I hope I'm a man of the world," said Mr. Enlightenment. "Any young fellow who is anxious to better himself may depend on finding sympathy and support in me. Puritania. Why, I suppose you have been brought up to be afraid of the landlord."
"Well, I must admit I sometimes do feel rather nervous."
"You may make your mind easy, my boy. There is no such person."
"There is no landlord?"
"There is absolutely no such thing. I might even say no such entity in existence. There never has been, and never will be."
"And is this absolutely certain?" cried John, for a great hope was rising in his heart.
"Absolutely certain. Look at me, young man. I ask you, do I look as if I was easily taken in?"
"Oh, no," said John hastily. "I was just wondering, though. I mean, how did they all come to think there was such a person?"
"The landlord is an invention of those stewards, all made up to keep the rest of us under their thumb. And of course the stewards are hand in glove with the police. They are a shrewd lot, those stewards. They know which side their bread is buttered on, all right. Clever fellows. And me, I can't help admiring them."
"But do you mean that the stewards don't believe it themselves?"
"I dare say they do. It's just the sort of cock and bull story they would believe. They are simple old souls, most of them, just like children. They have no knowledge of modern science, and they would believe anything they were told."
John was silent for a few minutes. Then he began again. "But how do you know there is no landlord?"
"Christopher Columbus, Galileo, the earth is round, invention of printing, gunpowder,"
exclaimed Mr. Enlightenment in such a loud voice that the pony shied. "I beg your pardon," said John.
"Eh?"
said Mr. Enlightenment. "I didn't quite understand," said John.
"Why, it's as plain as a pikestaff," said the other. "Your people in Puritania believe in the landlord because they have not had the benefits of a scientific training. For example, I dare say it would be news to you to hear that the earth was round. Round as an orange, my lad."
"Well, I don't know that it would," said John, feeling a little disappointed. "My father always said it was round."
"No, no, my dear boy," said Mr. Enlightenment. "You must have misunderstood him. It is well known that everyone in Puritania thinks the earth flat. It is not likely that I should be mistaken on such a point. Indeed, it is out of the question. Then again, there is the paleontological evidence."
"What's that?"
"Why, they tell you in Puritania that the landlord made all these roads. But that is quite impossible, for old people can remember the time when the roads were not nearly so good as they are now. And what is more, scientists have found all over the country the traces of old roads running in quite different directions. The inference is obvious."
John said nothing.
"I said," repeated Mr. Enlightenment, "that the inference was obvious."
"Oh, yes, of course," said John hastily, turning a little red.
"Then again, there is anthropology."
"I'm afraid I don't know."
"Bless me, of course you don't. They don't mean you to know.
An anthropologist is a man who goes round your backwood villages in these parts, collecting the odd stories that the country people tell about the landlord. Why, there is one village where they think he has a trunk, like an elephant. Now anyone can see that that couldn't be true.
It is very unlikely.
And what is better still, we know how the villagers came to think so. It all began by an elephant escaping from the local zoo, and then some old villager, he was probably drunk, saw it wandering about on the mountain one night, and so the story grew up that the landlord had a trunk.
Did they catch the elephant again?
Did who?
The anthropologists.
Oh, my dear boy, you are misunderstanding. This happened long before there were any anthropologists.
Then how do they know?
Well, as to that, I see you have a very crude notion of how science actually works. To put it simply, for of course you could not understand the technical explanation, to put it simply, they know that the escaped elephant must have been the source of the trunk story, because they know that an escaped snake must have been the source of the snake story in the next village, and so on. This is called the inductive method. Hypothesis, my dear young friend, establishes itself by a cumulative process. Or, to use popular language, if you make the same guess often enough, it ceases to be a guess and becomes a scientific fact.
After he had thought for a while, John said, "I think I see. Most of the stories about the landlord are probably untrue, therefore the rest are probably untrue."
Well, that is as near as a beginner can get to it, perhaps. But when you have had a scientific training, you will find that you can be quite certain about all sorts of things which now seem to you only probable.
By this time, the fat little pony had them several miles, and they had come to a place where a by-road went off to the right.
"If you are going west, we must part here," said Mr. Enlightenment, drawing up. "Unless perhaps you would care to come home with me. You see that magnificent city?"
John looked down by the by-road and saw in a flat plain without any trees a huge collection of corrugated iron huts, most of which seemed rather old and rusty.
"That," said Mr. Enlightenment, "is the city of Claptrap. You will hardly believe me when I say that I can remember it as a miserable village. When I first came here it had only 40 inhabitants. It now boasts a population of 12,400,361 souls, who include, I may add, the majority of our most influential publicists and scientific popularizers. In this unprecedented development I am proud to say that I have borne no small part. But it is no mock modesty to add that the invention of the printing press has been more important than any merely personal agency. If you would care to join us—"
"Well, thank you," said John, "but I think I will keep to the main road a little longer." He got out of the trap and turned to bid good-bye to Mr. Enlightenment. Then a sudden thought came into his head, and he said, "I'm not sure that I've really understood all your arguments, sir. Is it absolutely certain that there is no landlord?"
"Absolutely. I'll give you my word of honour."
With these words they shook hands. Mr. Enlightenment turned the pony's head up the by-road, gave it a touch with the whip, and in a few moments was out of sight. 2. The Hill. Then I saw John bounding forward on his road so lightly that before he knew it he had come to the top of a little hill. It was not because the hill had tired him that he stopped there, but because he was too happy to move. "There is no landlord," he cried. Such a weight had been lifted from his mind that he felt he could fly. All round him the frost was gleaming like silver, the sky was like blue glass, a robin sat in the hedge beside him, a cock was crowing in the distance. "There is no landlord!" He laughed when he thought of the old card of rules hung over his bed in the bedroom, so low and dark in his father's house. "There is no landlord! There is no black hole!" He turned and looked back on the road he had come by, and when he did so he gasped with joy. For there in the east, under the morning light, he saw the mountains heaped up to the sky like clouds, green and violet and dark red. Shadows were passing over the big rounded slopes, and water shone in the mountain pools, and up at the highest of all the sun was smiling steadily on the ultimate crags. These crags were indeed so shaped that you could easily take them for a castle. And now it came into John's head
that he had never looked at the mountains before, because, as long as he thought that the landlord lived there, he had been afraid of them. But now that there was no landlord, he perceived that they were beautiful. For a moment he almost doubted whether the island could be more beautiful, and whether he would not be wiser to go east instead of west. But it did not seem to him to matter, for he said, "If the world has the mountains at one end and the island at the other, then every road leads to beauty, and the world is a glory among glories." At that moment he saw a man walking up the hill to meet him. Now I knew in my dream that this man's name was Mr. Virtue, and he was about of an age with John, or a little older. "What is the name of this place?" said John. "It is called Jehovah-Jireh," said Mr. Virtue. Then they both turned and continued their journey to the west. After they had gone a little way, Mr. Virtue stole a glance at John's face, and then he smiled a little. "Why do you smile?" said John. "I was thinking that you looked very glad." "So would you be if you had lived in the fear of a landlord all your life and had just discovered that you were a free man." "Oh, it's that, is it?" "You don't believe in the landlord, do you?" "I know nothing about him, except by hearsay like the rest of us." "You wouldn't like to be under his thumb." "Wouldn't like? I wouldn't be under anyone's thumb." "You might have to, if he had a black hole." "I'd let him put me in the black hole sooner than take orders, if the orders were not to my mind." "Why, I think you are right. I can hardly believe it yet, that I need not obey the rules. There's that robin again. To think that I could have a shot at it if I liked and no one would interfere with me." "Do you want to?" "I'm not sure that I do," said John, fingering his sling. But when he looked round on the sunshine and remembered his great happiness and looked twice at the bird, he said, "No, I don't. There is nothing I want less. Still, I could if I liked." "You mean you could if you chose?" "Where's the difference?" "All the difference in the world." 3. A little southward. I thought that John would have questioned him further, but now they came in sight of a woman who was walking slower than they, so that presently they came up with her and wished her good day. When she turned, they saw that she was young and comely, though a little dark of complexion. She was friendly and frank, but not wanton, like the brown girls, and the whole world became pleasanter to the young men because they were travelling the same way with her. But first they told her their names, and she told them hers, which was Media Halfways. "And where are you travelling to, Mr. Virtue?" she asked. "To travel, hopefully, is better than to arrive," said Virtue. "Do you mean you're just out for a walk? Just for exercise?" "Certainly not," said Virtue, who was becoming a little confused. "I'm on a pilgrimage. I must admit, now that you press me, I've not a very clear idea of the end, but that is not the important question. These speculations don't make one a better walker. The great thing is to do one's 30 miles a day." "Why?" "Because that is the rule." "Ho, ho," said John, "so you do believe in the landlord after all?" "Not at all. I didn't say it was the landlord's rule." "Whose is it, then?" "It is my own rule. I made it myself." "But why?" "Well, that again is a speculative question. I have made the best rules I can. If I find any better ones, I shall adopt them. In the meantime, the great thing is to have rules of some sort, and to keep them." "And where are you going?" said Media, turning to John. Then John began to tell his companions about the island, and how he had first seen it, and was determined to give up everything for the hope of finding it. "Then you had better come and see my father," said she. "He lives in the city of Thrill, and at the bottom of this hill there is a turn to the left which will bring us there in half an hour." "Has your father been to the island? Does he know the way?" "He often talks about something very like it." "You had better come with us, Virtue," said John, "since you do not know where you are going, and there can be no place better to go than the island." "Certainly not," said Virtue. "We must keep to the road. We must keep on." "I don't see why," said John. "I dare say you don't," said Virtue. All this time they were going down the hill, and now they came to a little grassy lane on the left, which went off through a wood. Then I thought that John had a little hesitation, but partly because the sun was now hot, and the hard metal of the road was becoming sore to his feet, and partly because he felt a little angry with Virtue, and most of all because Media was going that way, he decided to turn down the lane. They said good-bye to Virtue, and he went on his way, stumping up the next hill without ever looking back. 4. Soft going. When they were in the lane, they walked more gently. The grass was soft under their feet, and the afternoon sun beating down on the sheltered place made it warm. And presently they heard a sound of sweet and melancholy chimes. "Those are the bells of the city," said Media. As they went on, they walked closer together, and soon they were walking arm in arm. Then they kissed each other, and after that they went on their way, kissing and talking in slow voices of sad and beautiful things, and the shadow of the wood and the sweetness of the girl and the sleepy sound of the bells reminded John a little bit of the island, and a little bit of the brown girls. "This is what I've been looking for all my life," said John. "The brown girls were too gross, and the island was too fine. This is the real thing." "This is love," said Media with a deep sigh. "This is the way to the real island." Then I dreamed that they came in sight of the city, very old and full of spires and turrets, all covered with ivy, where it lay in a little grassy valley built on both sides of a lazy, winding river. And they passed the gates in the ruinous old city wall and came and knocked at a certain door, and were let in. Then Media brought him into a darkish room with a vaulted roof and windows of stained glass, and exquisite food was brought to them. With the food came old Mr. Halfways. He was a gliding gentleman with soft silver hair and a soft silver voice, dressed in flowing robes, and he was so solemn with his long beard that John was reminded of the steward with his mask on. But it is much better than the steward, thought John, because there is nothing to be afraid of. Also, he doesn't need a mask. His face is really like that. 5. Leah for Rachel. As they ate, John told him about the island. "You will find your island here," said Mr. Halfways, looking into John's eyes. "But how can it be here in the middle of the city?" "It needs no place. It is everywhere and nowhere. It refuses entry to none who asks. It is an island of the soul," said the old gentleman. "Surely even in Puritania they told you that the landlord's castle was within you." "But I don't want the castle," said John, "and I don't believe in the landlord." "What is truth?" said the old man. "They were mistaken when they told you of the landlord, and yet they were not mistaken. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. The landlord they dreamed to find, we find in our hearts. The island you seek for, you already inhabit. The children of that country are never far from their fatherland." When the meal was ended, the old gentleman took a harp, and at the first sweep of his hand across the strings, John began to think of the music that he had heard by the window in the wall. Then came the voice, and it was no longer merely silver sweet and melancholy, like Mr. Halfway's speaking voice, but strong and noble and full of strange overtones, the noise of the sea and of all birds, and sometimes of wind and thunder. And John began to see a picture of the island with his eyes open. But it was more than a picture, for he sniffed the spicy smell, and the sharp brine of the sea mixed with it. He seemed to be in the water, only a few yards from the sand of the island. He could see more than he had ever seen before, but just as he had put down his feet and touched a sandy bottom, and was beginning to wade ashore, the song ceased. The whole vision went away. John found himself back in the dusky room, seated on a low divan, with Media by his side. "Now I shall sing you something else," said Mr. Halfways. "Oh, no," cried John, who was sobbing. "Sing the same again. Please sing it again." "You had better not hear it twice in the same evening. I have plenty of other songs." "I would die to hear the first one again," said John. "Well, well," said Mr. Halfways. "Perhaps you know best. Indeed, what does it matter? It is as short to the island one way as another." And then he smiled indulgently and shook his head, and John could not help thinking that his talking voice and talking manner were almost silly after the singing. But as soon as the great deep wall of the music began again, it swept everything else from his mind. It seemed to him that this time he got more pleasure from the first few notes, and even noticed delicious passages which had escaped him at the first hearing, and he said to himself, This is going to be even better than the other. I shall keep my head this time and sip all the pleasure at my ease." I saw that he settled himself more comfortably to listen, and Media slipped her hand into his. It pleased him to think that they were going to the island together. Now came the vision of the island again. But this time it was changed, for John scarcely noticed the island because of a lady with a crown on her head who stood waiting for him on the shore. She was fair, divinely fair. "At last," said John, "a girl with no trace of brown." And he began again to wade ashore, holding out his arms to embrace that queen. And his love for her appeared to him so great and so pure, and they had been parted for so long, that his pity for himself and her almost overwhelmed him. And as he was about to embrace her, the song stopped. "Sing it again! Sing it again!" cried John. "I liked it better the second time." "Well, if you insist," said Mr. Halfways, with a shrug. "It is nice to have a really appreciative audience." So he sang it the third time. This time John noticed yet more about the music. He began to see how several of the effects were produced, and that some parts were better than others. He wondered if it were not a trifle too long. The vision of the island was a little shadowy this time, and he did not take much notice of it. He put his arm round Media, and they lay cheek to cheek. He began to wonder if Mr. Halfways would never end. And when at last the final passage closed, with a sobbing break in the singer's voice, the old gentleman looked up and saw how the young people lay in one another's arms. Then he rose and said, "You have found your island. You have found it in one another's hearts." Then he tiptoed from the room, wiping his eyes. 6. Ichabod. "Media, I love you," said John. "We have come to the real island," said Media. "But, oh, alas," said he, "so long our bodies, why do we forbear? Else a great prince in prison lies," sighed she. "No one else can understand the mystery of our love," said he. At that moment a brisk, hobnailed step was heard, and a tall young man strode into the room carrying a light in his hand. He had coal-black hair and a straight mouth like the slit in a pillar-box, and he was dressed in various kinds of metal wire. As soon as he saw them, he burst into a great guffaw. The lovers instantly sprang up and apart. "Well, Brownie," said he, "at your tricks again?" "Don't call me that name," said Media, stamping her foot. "I've told you before not to call me that." The young man made an obscene gesture at her and then turned to John. "I see that old fool of a father of mine has been at you." "You have no right to speak that way of father," said Media. Then, turning to John, her cheeks flaming, her breast heaving, she said, "All is over. Our dream is shattered. Our mystery is profaned. I would have taught you all the secrets of love, and now you are lost to me forever. We must part. I shall go and kill myself." And with that she rushed from the room. 7. Non est hic. "Don't bother about her," said the young man. "She's threatened that 100 times. She's only a brown girl, though she doesn't know it." "A brown girl?" cried John. "And your father?" "My father has been in the pay of the brownies all his life. He doesn't know it, the old chucklehead. Calls them the muses, or the spirit, or some rot. In actual fact, he is by profession a pimp." "And the island?" said John. "We'll talk about it in the morning. Ain't the kind of island you're thinking of. Tell you what, I don't live with my father and my precious sister. I live in Escropolis, and I'm going back tomorrow. I'll take you down to the laboratory and show you some real poetry. Not fantasies, the real thing." "Thank you very much," said John. Then young Mr. Halfways found his room for him, and the whole of that household went to bed. 8. Great Promises. Gus Halfways was the name of Mr. Halfway's son. As soon as he rose in the morning, he called John down to breakfast with him so that they might start on their journey. There was no one to hinder them, for old Halfways was still asleep, and Media always had breakfast in bed. When they had eaten, Gus brought him into a shed beside his father's house and showed him a machine on wheels. "What is this?" said John. "My old bus," said young Halfways. Then he stood back, with his head on one side, and gazed at it for a bit, but presently he began to speak in a changed and reverent voice. "She is a poem. She is the daughter of the spirit of the age. What was the speed of Atalanta to her speed, the beauty of Apollo to her beauty?
Now beauty to John meant nothing save glimpses of his island, and the machine did not remind him of his island at all, so he held his tongue.
Don't you see, said Gus, our fathers made images of what they called gods and goddesses, but they were really only brown girls and brown boys whitewashed, as anyone found out by looking at them too long. All self-deception and phallic sentiment. But here you have the real art. Nothing erotic about her, eh?
Certainly not, said John, looking at the cog-wheels and coils of wire. It is certainly not at all like a brown girl. It was, in fact, more like a nest of hedgehogs and serpents.
I should say not, said Gus. Sheer power, eh? Speed, ruthlessness, austerity, significant form, eh? Also,
and here he dropped his voice,
very expensive indeed.
Then he made John sit in the machine, and he himself sat beside him. Then he began pulling the levers about, and for a long time nothing happened. But at last there came a flash and a roar, and the machine bounded into the air and then dashed forward. Before John had got his breath, they had flashed across a broad thoroughfare which he recognized as the main road, and were racing through the country to the north of it, a flat country of square stony fields divided by barbed wire fences. A moment later they were standing still in a city where all the houses were built of steel. Book 3. Through Darkest Zeitgeistheim. And every shrewd turn was exalted among men, and simple goodness, wherein nobility doth ever most participate, was mocked away and clean vanished. Thucydides. Now live the lesser as lords of the world, the busy travellers. Banished is our glory, the earth's excellence grows old and sere. Anon. The more ignorant men are, the more convinced are they that their little parish and their little chapel is an apex to which civilization and philosophy has painfully struggled up. Shaw. 1. Escropolis. Then I dreamed that he led John into a big room, rather like a bathroom. It was full of steel and glass, and the walls were nearly all window, and there was a crowd of people there, drinking what looked like medicine and talking at the tops of their voices. They were all either young or dressed up to look as if they were young. The girls had short hair and flat breasts and flat buttocks, so that they looked like boys, but the boys had pale egg-shaped faces and slender waists and big hips, so that they looked like girls, except for a few of them, who had long hair and beards. "What are they so angry about?" whispered John.
"They are not angry," said Gus. "They are talking about art."
And then he brought John into the middle of the room and said,
"Say, here's a guy who's been taken in by my father and wants some real 100% music to clean him out. We'd better begin with something neo-romantic to make the transition." Then all the clevers consulted together, and presently they all agreed that Victoriana had better sing first. When Victoriana rose, John at first thought that she was a schoolgirl, but after he had looked at her again, he perceived that she was, in fact, about 50. Before she began to sing, she put on a dress, which was a sort of exaggerated copy of Mr. Halfway's robes, and a mask, which was like the steward's mask, except that the nose had been painted bright red, and one of the eyes had been closed in a permanent wink. "Priceless!" exclaimed one half of the clevers. "Too Puritanian!" But the other half, which included all the bearded men, held their noses in the air and looked very stiff. Then Victoriana took a little toy harp and began. The noises of the toy harp were so strange that John could not think of them as music at all. Then, when she sang, he had a picture in his mind which was a little like the island, but he saw at once that it was not the island. And presently he saw people who looked rather like his father, and the steward and old Mr. Halfways, dressed up as clowns and doing a stiff sort of dance. Then there was a columbine, and some sort of love story. But suddenly the whole island turned into an aspidistra in a pot, and the song was over. "Priceless!" said the clevers. "I hope you liked it," said Gus to John. "Well," began John doubtfully, for he hardly knew what to say. But he got no further, for at that moment he had a very great surprise. Victoriana had thrown her mask away and walked up to him and slapped him in the face twice, as hard as she could. "That's right," said the Clevers. "Victoriana has courage. We may not all agree with you, Vicky dear, but we admire your courage." "You may persecute me as much as you like," said Victoriana to John. "No doubt to see me thus with my back to the wall wakes the hunting lust in you. You will always follow the cry of the majority, but I will fight to the end. So there." And she began to cry. "I am extremely sorry," said John, "but—" "And I know it was a good song," sobbed Victoriana, "because all great singers are persecuted in their lifetime, and I'm persecuted, and therefore I must be a great singer." "She has you there," said the Clevers, as Victoriana left the laboratory. "You mustn't mind her being a little bitter," said Gus. "She's so temperamental and sensitive, and she has suffered a great deal." "Well, I must admit," said one of the Clevers, "now that she had gone, that I think that stuff of hers rather vieux jeu." "Can't stand it myself," said another. "I think it was her face that needed slapping," said a third. "She's been spoiled and flattered all her life," said a fourth. "That's what's the matter with her." "Quite," said the rest in chorus. 2. A South Wind. "Perhaps," said Gus, "someone else would give us a song." "I will," cried 30 voices all together. But one cried much louder than the others, and its owner had stepped into the middle of the room before anyone could do anything about it. He was one of the bearded men, and wore nothing but a red shirt and a codpiece made of the skins of crocodiles. And suddenly he began to beat on an African tom-tom, and to croon with his voice, swaying his lean, half-clad body to and fro, and staring at them all, out of eyes which were like burning coals. And this time John saw no picture of an island at all. He seemed to be in a dark green place, full of tangled roots and hairy vegetable tubes, and all at once he saw in it shapes moving and writhing that were not vegetable, but human. And the dark green grew darker, and a fierce heat came out of it, and suddenly all the shapes that were moving in the darkness came together to make a single obscene image which dominated the whole room, and the song was over. "Priceless," said the Clevers. "Too stark, too virile." John blinked and looked round, and when he saw all the Clevers as cool as cucumbers, smoking their cigarettes and drinking the drinks that looked like medicines, all as if nothing remarkable had happened, he was troubled in his mind. For he thought that the song must have meant something different to them, and, if so, he argued, what very pure-minded people they must be. Feeling himself among his betters, he became ashamed. "You like it, Hein?" said the bearded singer. I don't think I understood it," said John. "I make you like it, Hein," said the singer, snatching up his tom-tom again. "It was what you really wanted all the time." "No, no," cried John. "I know you're wrong there. I grant you that sort of thing is what I always get if I think too long about the island. But it can't be what I want." "No? Why not?" "If it is what I wanted, why am I so disappointed when I get it? If what a man really wanted was food, how could he be disappointed when the food arrived? As well, I don't understand." "What you not understand? I explain to you." "Well, it's like this. I thought that you objected to Mr. Halfway's singing, because it led to brown girls in the end." "So we do." "Well, why is it better to lead to black girls in the beginning?" A low whistle ran round the whole laboratory. John knew he had made a horrible blunder. "Look here," said the bearded singer in a new voice. "What do you mean? You are not suggesting that there is anything of that kind about my singing, are you?" I suppose perhaps it was my fault," stammered John. "In other words," said the singer, "you are not yet able to distinguish between art and pornography." And advancing towards John very deliberately, he spat in his face and turned to walk out of the room. "That's right, Fally," cried the Clevers. "Serve him right." "Filthy-minded little beast," said one. "Yeah, Puritanian," said a girl. "I expect he's impotent," whispered another. "You mustn't be too hard on him," said Gus. "He is full of inhibitions, and everything he says is only a rationalization of them. Perhaps he will get on better with something more formal. Why don't you sing, Glugley?" 3. Freedom of thought. Glugley instantly rose. She was very tall and as lean as a post, and her mouth was not quite straight in her face. When she was in the middle of the room and silence had been obtained, she began to make gestures. First of all, she set her arms akimbo and cleverly turned her hands the wrong way, so it looked as if her wrists were sprained. Then she waddled to and fro with her toes pointing in. After that, she twisted herself to make it look as if her hip bone was out of joint. Finally, she made some grunts and said, "Globble obble oogle oggle globble gloogle gloo," and ended by pursing up her lips and making a vulgar noise such as children make in their nurseries. Then she went back to her place and sat down. "Thank you very much," said John politely. But Gluggly made no reply, for Gluggly could not talk, owing to an accident in infancy. "I hope you liked it," said young Halfways. I didn't understand her. "Ah," said a woman in spectacles, who seemed to be Gluggly's nurse or keeper. "That is because you are looking for beauty. You are still thinking of your island. You've got to realize that satire is the moving force in modern music." "It is the expression of a savage disillusionment," said someone else. "Reality has broken down," said a fat boy who had drunk a great deal of the medicine and was lying flat on his back, smiling happily. "Our art must be brutal," said Gluggly's nurse. "We lost our ideals when there was a war in this country," said a very young clever. "They were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. That is why we have to be so stark and brutal." "But look here," cried John. "That war was years ago. It was your fathers who were in it. And they are all settled down and living ordinary lives." "Puritanian, bourgeois," cried the clevers. Everyone seemed to have risen. "Hold your tongue," whispered Gus in John's ear. But already someone had struck John on the head, and as he bowed under the blow, someone else hit him from behind. "It was the mud and blood," hissed the girls all round him. "Well," said John, ducking to avoid a retort that had been flung at him, "if you are really old enough to remember that war, why do you pretend to be so young?" "We are young," they howled. "We are the new movement. We are the revolt." "We have got over humanitarianism," bellowed one of the bearded men, kicking John on the kneecap. "And prudery," said a thin little old maid, trying to wrench his clothes off from the neck. And at the same moment 6 girls leapt at his face with their nails, and he was kicked in the back and the belly, and tripped up so that he fell on his face, and hit again as he rose, and all the glass in the world seemed breaking round his head as he fled for his life from the laboratory. And all the dogs of Escropolis joined in the chase as he ran along the street, and all the people followed, pelting him with ordure and crying, "Puritanian, bourgeois, prurient." 4. The man behind the gun. When John could run no further, he sat down. The noise of the pursuers had died away, and looking back, he could see no sign of Escropolis. He was covered with filth and blood, and his breathing hurt him. There seemed to be something wrong with one of his wrists. As he was too tired to walk, he sat still and thought for a while. And first he thought that he would like to go back to Mr. Halfway's. "It is true," he said, "that if you listened to him too long, it would lead you to Media, and she had a trace of brown in her. But then you had a glimpse of the island first. Now the clevers took you straight to brown girls, or worse, without even a glimpse of the island. I wonder, would it be possible to keep always at the island stage with Mr. Halfways? Must it always end like that?" Then it came into his head that after all he did not want Mr. Halfway's songs, but the island itself, and that this was the only thing he wanted in the world. And when he remembered this, he rose very painfully to continue his journey, looking round for the west. He was still in flat country, but there seemed to be mountains ahead, and above them the sun was setting. A road ran towards them, so he began to limp along it. Soon the sunset disappeared, and the sky was clouded over, and a cold rain began. When he had limped about a mile, he passed a man who was mending the fence of his field and smoking a big cigar. John stopped and asked him if he knew the way to the sea. "Nope," said the man without looking up. "Do you know of any place in this country where I could get a night's lodging?" "Nope," said the man. "Could you give me a piece of bread?" said John. "Certainly not," said Mr. Mammon. "It will be contrary to all economic laws. It would pauperize you." Then, when John lingered, he added, "Move on. I don't want any loiterers about here." And John limped on for about 10 minutes. Suddenly he heard Mr. Mammon calling out to him. He stopped and turned round. "What do you want?" shouted John. "Come back," said Mr. Mammon. John was so tired and hungry that he humbled himself to walk back, and the way seemed long, in the hope that Mammon had relented. When he came again to the place where they had talked before, the man finished his work without speaking, and then said, "Where did you get your clothes torn?" "I had a quarrel with the Clevers in Escropolis." "Clevers?
Don't you know them?"
Never heard of them."
"You know Escropolis?"
"Know it? I own Escropolis."
"How do you mean?"
"What do you suppose they live on?"
"I never thought of that."
"Every man of them earns his living by writing for me or having shares in my land. I suppose the Clevers is some nonsense they do in their spare time, when they're not beating up tramps."
And he glanced at John. Then he resumed his work.
"You needn't wait,"
he said presently. 5. Under arrest. Then I turned round and immediately began to dream again, and I saw John plodding westward in the dark and the rain in great distress, because he was too tired to go on and too cold to stop. And after a time there came a north wind that drove the rain away and skinned the puddles with ice, and set the bare boughs clashing in the trees, and the moon came out. Now John looked up with his teeth chattering, and saw that he was entering into a long valley of rocks, with high cliffs on the right and the left, and the far end of the valley was barred with a high cliff all across, except for one narrow pass in the middle. The moonlight lay white on this cliff, and right amidst it was a huge shadow like a man's head. John glanced over his shoulder and saw that the shadow was thrown by a mountain behind him, which he had passed in the darkness. It was far too cold for a man to stay still in the wind, and I dreamed of John going stumblingly forward up the valley, till now he had come to the rock wall, and was about to enter the pass. But just as he rounded a great boulder and came full in sight of the pass, he saw some armed men sitting in it by a brazier, and immediately they sprang up and barred his way. "You can't pass here," said their leader. "Where can I pass?" said John. "Where are you going to?" "I'm going to find the sea in order to set sail for an island that I've seen in the west." "Then you cannot pass." "By whose orders?" "Do you not know that all this country belongs to the spirit of the age?" "I am sorry," said John. "I didn't know. I have no wish to trespass. I will go round some other way. I will not go through his country at all." "You fool," said the captain. "You are in his country now. This pass is the way out of it, not the way into it. He welcomes strangers. His quarrel is with runaways." Then he called to one of his men and said, "Here, Enlightenment, take this fugitive to our master." A young man stepped out and clapped fetters upon John's hands. Then, putting the length of chain over his own shoulder and giving it a jerk, he began to walk down the valley, dragging John after him. 6. Poisoning the wells. Then I saw them going down the valley, the way John had come up, with the moon full in their faces, and up against the moon was the mountain which had cast the shadow, and now it looked more like a man than before. "Mr. Enlightenment," said John at last, "is it really you?" "Why should it not be?" said the guard. "You looked so different when I met you before." "We have never met before." "What? Did you not meet me at the inn on the borders of Puritania and drive me 5 miles in your pony trap?" "Oh, that," said the other. "That must have been my father, old Mr. Enlightenment. He is a vain and ignorant old man, almost a Puritanian, and we never mention him in the family. I am Sigismund Enlightenment, and I have long since quarrelled with my father." They went on in silence for a bit. Then Sigismund spoke again. "It may save trouble if I tell you at once the best reason for not trying to escape, namely that there is nowhere to escape to." "How do you know there is no such place as my island?" "Do you wish very much that there was?" "I do." "Have you never before imagined anything to be true because you greatly wished for it?" John thought for a little, and then he said, "Yes." "And your island is like an imagination, isn't it?" "I suppose so." "It is just the sort of thing you would imagine merely through wanting it. The whole thing is very suspicious. But answer me another question. Have you ever once yet, had a vision of the island that did not end in brown girls?" "I don't know that I have." "But they weren't what I wanted." "No, what you wanted was to have them, and with them the satisfaction of feeling that you were good. Hence the island." "You mean
The island was the pretence that you put up to conceal your own lusts from yourself. All the same, I was disappointed when it ended like that. Yes, you were disappointed at finding that you could not have it both ways, but you lost no time in having it the way you could. You did not reject the brown girls. They went on in silence for a time, and always the mountain, with its odd shape, grew bigger in front of them, and now they were in its shadow. Then John spoke again, half in his sleep, for he was very tired. After all, it isn't only my island. I might go back east and try the mountains. The mountains do not exist. How do you know? Have you ever been there? Have you ever seen them except at night, or in a blaze of sunrise? No. And your ancestors must have enjoyed thinking that when their leases were out, they would go up to the mountains and live in the landlord's castle. It is a more cheerful prospect than going nowhere. I suppose so. It is clearly one more of the things people wish to believe. But do we never do anything else? Are all the things I see at this moment there only because I wish to see them? Most of them, said Sigismund. For example, you would like that thing in front of us to be a mountain. That is why you think it is a mountain. Why? Cried John. What is it? And then in my nightmare I thought John became like a terrified child and put his hands over his eyes not to see the giant. But young Mr. Enlightenment tore his hands away and forced his face round and made him see the spirit of the age, where it sat like one of the stone giants, the size of a mountain with its eyes shut. Then Mr. Enlightenment opened a little door among the rocks and flung John into a pit made in the side of a hill just opposite the giant, so that the giant could look into it through its gratings. He will open his eyes presently, said Mr. Enlightenment. Then he locked the door and left John in prison. 7. Facing the facts. John lay in his fetters all night in the cold and stench of the dungeon. And when morning came there was a little light at the grating, and looking round John saw that he had many fellow prisoners, of all sexes and ages, but instead of speaking to him they all huddled away from the light and drew as far back into the pit, away from the grating, as they could. But John thought that if he could breathe a little fresh air he would be better, and he crawled up to the grating. But as soon as he looked out and saw the giant, it crushed the heart out of him, and even as he looked, the giant began to open his eyes, and John, without knowing why he did it, shrank from the grating. Now I dreamed that the giant's eyes had this property, that whatever they looked on became transparent. Consequently, when John looked round into the dungeon, he retreated from his fellow prisoners in terror, for the place seemed to be thronged with demons. A woman was seated near him, but he did not know it was a woman, because through the face he saw the skull, and through that the brains and the passages of the nose, and the larynx, and the saliva moving in the glands, and the blood in the veins, and lower down the lungs panting like sponges, and the liver and the intestines like a coil of snakes. And when he averted his eyes from her, they fell on an old man, and this was worse, for the old man had a cancer, and when John sat down and drooped his head not to see the horrors, he saw only the working of his own inwards. Then I dreamed of all these creatures living in that hole under the giant's eye for many days and nights. And John looked round on it all, and suddenly he fell on his face and thrust his hands into his eyes and cried out, "It is a black hole! There may be no landlord, but it is true about the black hole. I am mad. I am dead. I am in hell forever." 8. Parrot disease. Every day a jailer brought the prisoners their food, and as he laid down the dishes he would say a word to them. If their meal was flesh, he would remind them that they were eating corpses, or give them some account of the slaughtering. Or if it was the inwards of some beast, he would read them a lecture in anatomy, and show the likeness of the mess to the same parts in themselves, which was the more easily done because the giant's eyes were always staring into the dungeon at dinner-time. Or if the meal were eggs, he would recall to them that they were eating the menstruum of a verminous fowl, and crack a few jokes with the female prisoner. So he went on day by day. Then I dreamed that one day there was nothing but milk for them, and the jailer said as he put down the pipkin, "Our relations with the cow are not delicate, as you can easily see if you imagine eating any of her other secretions." Now John had been in the pit a shorter time than any of the others, and at these words something seemed to snap in his head, and he gave a great sigh, and suddenly spoke out in a loud, clear voice, "Thank heaven! Now at last I know that you are talking nonsense."
"What do you mean?"
said the jailer, wheeling round upon him. "You are trying to pretend that unlike things are like. You are trying to make us think that milk is the same sort of thing as sweat or dung."
"And pray, what difference is there except by custom?"
"Are you a liar or only a fool that you see no difference between that which nature casts out as refuse and that which she stores up as food?"
"So nature is a person, then, with purposes and consciousness," said the jailer with a sneer. "In fact, a landlady. No doubt it comforts you to imagine you can believe that sort of thing."
And he turned to leave the prison with his nose in the air. "I know nothing about that," shouted John after him. "I am talking of what happens. Milk does feed calves, and dung does not."
"Look here," cried the jailer, coming back. "We have had enough of this. That is high treason, and I shall bring you before the master."
Then he jerked John up by his chain and began to drag him towards the door. But John, as he was being dragged, cried out to the others, "Can't you see it's all a cheat?" Then the jailer struck him in the teeth so hard that his mouth was filled with blood, and he became unable to speak. And while he was silent, the jailer addressed the prisoners and said,
"You see, he is trying to argue. Now tell me, someone, what is argument?"
And there was a confused murmur.
"Come, come," said the jailer. "You must know your catechisms by now. You there."
And he pointed to a prisoner a little older than a boy, whose name was Master Parrot.
"What is argument?"
"Argument," said Master Parrot, "is the attempted rationalization of the arguer's desires."
"Very good," replied the jailer. "But you should turn out your toes and put your hands behind your back. That is better. Now, what is the proper answer to an argument providing the existence of the landlord?"
"The proper answer is, you say that because you are a steward."
"Good boy. But hold your head up, that's right. And what is the answer to an argument proving that Mr. Fally's songs are just as brown as Mr. Halfway's?"
"There are two only generally necessary to damnation," said Master Parrot. "The first is, you say that because you are a Puritanian, and the second is, you say that because you are a sensualist."
"Good. Now just one more. What is the answer to an argument turning on the belief that 2 and 2 make 4?
"The answer is, you say that because you are a mathematician."
"You are a very good boy," said the jailer. "And when I come back I shall bring you something nice. And now, for you," he added, giving John a kick and opening the grating.
9. The Giant Slayer. When they came out into the air, John blinked a little, but not much, for they were still only in a half-light under the shadow of the giant, who was very angry, with smoke coming from his mouth, so that he looked more like a volcano than an ordinary mountain. And now John gave himself up for lost, but just as the jailer had dragged him up to the giant's feet, and had cleared his throat, and begun,
"The case against this prisoner,"
there was a commotion and a sound of horses' hoofs. The jailer looked round, and even the giant took his terrible eyes off John and looked round, and last of all John himself looked round too. They saw some of the guard coming towards them leading a great black stallion, and in it was seated a figure wound in a cloak of blue, which was hooded over the head and came down concealing the face. "Another prisoner, Lord," said the leader of the guards. Then very slowly the giant raised his great heavy finger and pointed to the mouth of the dungeon. "Not yet," said the hooded figure. Then suddenly it stretched out its hands with the fetters on them and made a quick movement of the wrists. There was a tinkling sound as the fragments of the broken chain fell on the rock at the horse's feet, and the guardsman let go the bridle and fell back, watching. Then the rider threw back the cloak, and a flash of steel smote light into John's eyes and on the giant's face. John saw that it was a woman in the flower of her age. She was so tall that she seemed to him a Titaness, a sun-bright virgin clad in complete steel, with a sword naked in her hand. The giant bent forward in his chair and looked at her.
"Who are you?" he said.
"My name is Reason," said the virgin.
"Make out her passport quickly," said the giant in a low voice, "and let her go through our dominions and be off with all the speed she wishes."
"Not yet," said Reason. "I will ask you 3 riddles before I go, for a wager."
"What is the pledge?"
said the giant. "Your head," said Reason. There was silence for a time among the mountains.
"Well,"
said the giant at last,
"what must be, must be. Ask on."
"This is my first riddle," said Reason. "What is the colour of things in dark places, of fish in the depth of the sea, or of the entrails in the body of man?"
"I cannot say,"
said the giant. "Well," said Reason, "now hear my second riddle. There was a certain man who was going to his own house, and his enemy went with him. And his house was beyond a river too swift to swim and too deep to wade, and he could go no faster than his enemy. While he was on his journey, his wife sent to him and said, 'You know that there is only one bridge across the river. Tell me, shall I destroy it that the enemy may not cross, or shall I leave it standing that you may cross?' What should this man do?"
"It is too hard for me,"
said the giant. "Well," said Reason, "try now to answer my third riddle. By what rule do you tell a copy from an original?" The giant muttered and mumbled and could not answer, and Reason set spurs in her stallion, and it leapt up onto the giant's mossy knees and galloped up his foreleg till she plunged her sword into his heart. Then there was a noise and a crumbling like a landslide, and the huge carcass settled down, and the spirit of the age became what he had seemed to be at first, a sprawling hummock of rock. Book 4. Back to the Road. Doth any man doubt that if there were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men poor shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition, and unpleasing to themselves? Bacon. 1. Let grill be grill. The guards had fled. Reason dismounted from her horse and wiped her sword clean on the moss of the foothills which had been the giant's knees. Then she turned to the door of the pit and struck it so that it broke, and she could look into the darkness of the pit and smell the filth. "You can all come out," she said. But there was no movement from within. Only John could hear the prisoners wailing together and saying, "It is one more wish-fulfillment dream. It is one more wish-fulfillment dream. Don't be taken in again." But presently Master Parrot came to the mouth of the pit and said, "It is no good trying to fool us. Once bit, twice shy." Then he put out his tongue and retired. "This psittacosis is a very obstinate disorder," said Reason, and she turned to mount the black horse. "May I come with you, lady?" said John. "You may come until you are tired," said Reason. 2. Archetype and Ectype. In my dream I saw them set off together, John walking by the lady's stirrup. And I saw them go up the rocky valley where John had gone on the night of his capture. They found the pass unguarded, and gave it back an echo to the horses' hoofs, and then in a moment they were out of the mountain country, and going down a grassy slope into the land beyond. There were few trees and bare, and it was cold, but presently John looked aside and saw a crocus in the grass. For the first time for many days the old sweetness pierced through John's heart, and the next moment he was trying to call back the sound of the birds wheeling over the island, and the green of the waves breaking on its sand, for they had all flashed about him but so quickly that they were gone before he knew. His eyes were wet. He turned to Reason and spoke. "You can tell me, lady, is there such a place as the island in the west, or is it only a feeling of my own mind?" "I cannot tell you," said she, "because you do not know. But you know. But I can tell you only what you know. I can bring things out of the dark part of your mind into the light part of it. But now you ask me what is not even in the dark of your mind. Even if it were only a feeling in my own mind, would it be a bad feeling? I have nothing to tell you of good and bad." "I mean this," said John, "and this you can tell me. Is it true that it must always end in brown girls? Or rather, that it really begins from brown girls? They say it is all a pretense, all a disguise for lust. And what do you think of that saying? It is very like that, said John. Both are sweet. Both are full of longing. The one runs into the other. They are very alike. Indeed they are, said the lady. But do you not remember my third riddle? About the copy and the original? I could not understand it. Well, now you shall. The people in the country we have just left have seen that your love for the island is very like your love for the brown girls. Therefore they say that one is a copy of the other. They would also say that you have followed me because I am like your mother, and that your trust in me is a copy of your love for your mother. And then they would say again that your love for your mother is a copy of your love for the brown girls, and so they would come full circle. And what should I answer them? You would say perhaps one is a copy of the other, but which is the copy of which? I never thought of that. You are not yet of an age to have thought much, said Reason, but you must see that if two things are alike, then it is a further question whether the first is copied from the second, or the second from the first, or both from a third. What would the third be? Some have thought that all these loves were copies of our love for the landlord. But surely they have considered that and rejected it. Their sciences have disproved it. They could not have, for their sciences are not concerned at all with the general relations of this country to anything that may lie east of it or west of it. They indeed will tell you that their researchers have proved that if two things are similar, the fair one is always the copy of the foul one. But their only reason to say so is that they have already decided that the fairest things of all, that is the landlord, and, if you like, the mountains and the island, are a mere copy of this country. They pretend that their researches lead to that doctrine, but in fact they assume that doctrine first, and interpret their researches by it. But they have reasons for assuming it. They have none, for they have ceased to listen to the only people who can tell them anything about it. Who are they? They are younger sisters of mine, and their names are Philosophy and Theology. Sisters. Who is your father? You will know sooner than you wish. And now the evening was falling, and they were near a little farm. So they turned in there and asked a night's lodging of the farmer, which was readily given them. 3. Esse is percipi. Next morning they continued their journey together. In my dream I saw them go through a country of little hills, where the road was always winding to conform to the lie of the valleys, and John walked at the lady's stirrup. The fetter of his hands had broken at the moment when she killed the giant, but the handcuffs were still on his wrists. One half of the broken chain hung down from each hand. There was a greater mildness in the air this day, and the buds were fully formed in the hedges. I have been thinking, lady, said John, of what you said yesterday, and I think I understand that though the island is very like the place where I first met the brown girl, yet she might be the shadow and the island the reality. But there is one thing that troubles me. What is that? Said Reason. I cannot forget what I have seen in the giant's prison. If we are really like that inside, whatever we imagine must be abominable, however innocent it looks. It may be true in general that the foul thing is not always the original, and the fair thing not always the copy, but when we have to do with human imaginations, with things that come out of us, surely then the giant is right. There at least it is much more likely that whatever seems good is only a veil for the bad, only a part of our skin that has so far escaped the giant's eyes and not yet become transparent. There are two things to be said about that, replied the lady, and the first is this. Who told you that the island was an imagination of yours? Well, you would not assure me that it was anything real, nor that it was not. But I must think it is one or the other. By my father's soul, you must not, until you have some evidence. Can you not remain in doubt? I don't know that I have ever tried. You must learn to, if you are to come far with me. It is not hard to do it. In Ascropolis, indeed, it is impossible, for the people who live there have to give an opinion once a week or once a day, or else Mr. Mammon would soon cut off their food. But out here in the country you can walk all day and all the next day with an unanswered question in your head. You need never speak until you have made up your mind. But if a man wanted to know so badly that he would die unless the question was decided, and no more evidence turned up, then he would die. That would be all. They went on in silence for a while. You said there were two things to say, said John. What was the second? The second was this. Did you think that the things you saw in the dungeon were real? That we really are like that? Of course I did. It is only our skin that hides them. Then I must ask you the same question that I asked the giant. What is the colour of things in the dark? I suppose no colour at all. And what of their shape? Have you any notion of it, save as what could be seen or touched, or what you could collect from many seeings and touchings? I don't know that I have. Then do you not see how the giant has deceived you? Not quite clearly. He showed you by a trick what our inwards would look like if they were visible. That is, he showed you something that is not, but something that would be if the world were made all other than it is. But in the real world, our inwards are invisible. They are not coloured shapes at all. They are feelings. The warmth in your limbs at this moment, the sweetness of your breath as you draw it in, the comfort in your belly because we breakfasted well, and your hunger for the next meal, these are the reality. All the sponges and tubes that you saw in the dungeon are the lie. But if I cut a man open, I should see them in him. A man cut open is, so far, not a man. And if you did not sew him up speedily, you would be seeing not organs, but death. I am not denying that death is ugly, but the giant made you believe that life is ugly. I cannot forget the man with the cancer. What you saw was unreality. The ugly lump was the giant's trick. The reality was pain, which has no colour or shape. Is that much better? That depends on the man. I think I begin to see. Is it surprising that things should look strange if you see them as they are not? If you take an organ out of a man's body, or a longing out of the dark part of a man's mind, and give to the one the shape and colour, and to the other the self-consciousness, which they never have in reality, would you expect them to be other than monstrous? Is there then no truth at all in what I saw under the giant's eyes? Some pictures are useful to physicians. Then I really am clean, said John. I am not like those. Reason smiled. There too, she said, there is truth mixed up with the giant's conjuring tricks. It will do you no harm to remember from time to time the ugly sights inside. You come of a race that cannot afford to be proud. As she spoke, John looked up, in doubt of her meaning, and for the first time since he came into her company he felt afraid. But the impression lasted only a moment. Look, said John, here is a little inn. Is it not time that we rested and ate something? 4. Escape. In the warmth of the afternoon they went on again, and it came into John's mind to ask the lady the meaning of her second riddle. It has two meanings, said she, and in the first the bridge signifies reasoning. The spirit of the age wishes to allow argument and not to allow argument. How is that? You heard what they said. If anyone argues with them, they say that he is rationalizing his own desires, and therefore need not be answered. But if anyone listens to them, they will then argue themselves to show that their own doctrines are true. I see. And what is the cure for this? You must ask them whether any reasoning is valid or not. If they say no, then their own doctrines, being reached by reasoning, fall to the ground. If they say yes, then they will have to examine your arguments and refute them on their merits. For if some reasoning is valid, for all they know, your bit of reasoning may be one of the valid bits. I see, said John. But what was the second interpretation? In the second, said Reason, the bridge signifies the giant's own favourite doctrine of the wish-fulfillment dream. For this also he wishes to use and not to use. I don't see how he wishes not to use it. Does he not keep on telling people that the landlord is a wish-fulfillment dream? Yes, surely that is true. The only true thing he did say. Now think. Is it really true that the giant and Sigismund and the people in Niscropolis and Mr. Halfways are going about filled with a longing that there should be a landlord and cards of rules and a mountain land beyond the brook with a possibility of a black hole? Then John stood still on the road to think. And first he gave a shake of his shoulders, and then he put his hands to his sides, and then he began to laugh till he was almost shaken to pieces. And when he had nearly finished, the vastness and impudence and simplicity of the fraud which had been practised came over him all again, and he laughed harder. And just when he had nearly recovered and was beginning to get his breath again, suddenly he had a picture in his mind of Victoriana and Lugley and Gus Halfways, and how they would look if a rumour reached them that there was a landlord and he was coming to Ascropolis. This was too much for him, and he laughed so hard that the broken chains of the spirit of the age fell off his wrists altogether. But all the while Reason sat and watched him. "You had better hear the rest of the argument," she said at last. "It may not be such a laughing matter as you suppose." "Oh, yes, the argument," said John, wiping his eyes. "You see now the direction in which the giant does not want the wish-fulfillment theory used?" "I'm not sure that I do," said John. "Don't you see what follows if you adopt his own rules?" "No," said John, very loudly, for a terrible apprehension was stealing over him. "But you must see," said Reason, "that for him and all his subjects, disbelief in the landlord is a wish-fulfillment dream. I shall not adopt his rules. You would be foolish not to have profited at all by your stay in his country," said Reason. "There is some force in the wish-fulfillment doctrine." "Some, perhaps, but very little. I only wanted to make it clear that whatever force it had was in favor of the landlord's existence, not against it, especially in your case." "Why especially in mine?" said John sulkily. "Because the landlord is the thing you have been most afraid of all your life. I do not say that any theory should be accepted because it is disagreeable, but if any should, then belief in the landlord should be accepted first." As Reason said these words, they had reached the top of a little hill, and John begged for a halt, being out of breath. He looked back and saw beyond the green rolling country the dark line of mountains, which was the frontier of the giant's land. But behind them, and far bigger, rose the old mountains of the east, picked out in the rays of the declining sun against a dark sky. They seemed no smaller than when John had looked at them long ago from Puritania. "I do not know where you are leading me," he said at last, "and among all these winding roads I have lost my sense of direction. As well, I find the pace of your horse fatiguing. If you will excuse me, I think I will henceforth pursue my journey alone." "As you wish," said Reason, "but I would strongly advise you to take this turn to the left." "Where does it go to?" asked John suspiciously. "It takes you back to the main road," said Reason. "That will do well enough," said John. "And now, lady, give me your blessing before I go." "I have no blessing to give," said the Virgin. "I do not deal in blessings and cursings." Then John bade her goodbye and took the road she had pointed out to him. As soon as she was out of sight, I dreamed that he put down his head and ran, for the silly fellow supposed that she might follow him. And he continued running until he found that he was going up a hill so steep that it left him no breath for running, and at the very top his road cut into another, which ran left and right along the ridge. Then John looked one way along it to the east, and the other way along it to the west, and saw that it was indeed the main road. He stayed for a minute to mop his brow. Then he turned to the right, with his face towards the setting sun, and resumed his journey. Book 5. The Grand Canyon. Not by road and foot, nor by sail and ocean shalt thou find any course that reaches the world beyond the north. Pindar. The ephemerals have no help to give. Behold them, they are deedless and cripple, like to a dream. The kind of mortals is bound with a chain, and their eyes are in darkness. Aeschylus. Alas, what can they teach and not mislead, ignorant of themselves, of God much more, and how the world began, and how man fell? Milton. 1. The Grand Canyon. The main road soon began to ascend, and after a short climb John found himself on a bleak tableland which continued to rise before him, but at a gentler angle. After he had walked a mile or so, he saw the figure of a man ahead, outlined against the setting sun. At first the figure stood still. Then it took a few paces to the left and to the right, as if in indecision. Then it turned about to face him, and to his surprise hailed him as an old acquaintance. Because of the light in his face, John could not at first see who it was, and they had joined hands before he knew that it was Virtue. "What can have delayed you?" cried John. "I thought by your pace when I left you that you would have been a week's journey ahead of me by now."
"If you think that," said Virtue, "your way must have been easier than mine. Have you not crossed mountains?" I came through a pass, said John.
The main road took them without a bend, said Virtue, and I often made scarcely 10 miles a day, but that does not signify. I have learned something of climbing and sweated off a good deal of soft flesh. What has really delayed me is this. I've been here for several days.
With that he motioned John to proceed, and they went forward together to the brow of the slope. Then I saw John start back a pace or so with a cry, for he had found that he stood on the edge of a precipice. Then presently he reapproached it with caution and looked. He saw that the road ran up without warning to the edge of a great gorge or chasm, and ended in the air, as if it had been broken off. The chasm might be 7 miles wide, and as for its length, it stretched southward on his left, and northward on his right, as far as he could see. The sun shining in his face cast all the further side into shadow, so that he could not see much of it clearly. It seemed to him, however, a rich country from the verdure and the size of the trees.
I have been exploring the cliffs, said Virtue, and I think we could get halfway down. Come a little nearer. You see that ledge?
I have a very poor head for heights, said John.
That one,
said Virtue, pointing to a narrow strip of greenery 1,000 feet below them.
I could never reach it. Oh, you could reach that easily enough. The difficulty is to know what happens beyond it. I'm inclined to think that it overhangs, and though we could get down to it, I'm not sure that we could get back if the rest of the descent was impracticable.
Then it would be madness to trust ourselves so far.
I don't know about that. It will be in accordance with the rule.
What rule?
The rule is,
said Virtue,
that if we have 1 chance out of 100 of surviving, we must attempt it. But if we have none, absolutely none, then it will be self-destruction, and we need not.
It is no rule of mine, said John.
But it is. We all have the same set of rules, really, you know.
If it is a rule of mine, it is one that I cannot obey.
I don't think I understand you, said Virtue. But of course you may be such a bad climber that you wouldn't have even 1 chance. That would make a difference, I allow.
Then a third voice spoke.
You have neither of you any chance at all, unless I carry you down.
Both the young men turned at the sound. An old woman was seated in a kind of rocky chair at the very edge of the precipice.
Oh, it's you, Mother Kirk, is it?
Said Virtue, and added in an undertone to John,
I've seen her about the cliffs more than once. Some of the country people say she is second-sighted, and some that she is crazy.
I shouldn't trust her, said John in the same tone. She looks to me much more like a witch. Then he turned to the old woman and said aloud, And how could you carry us down, Mother? We would be more fit to carry you.
I could do it, though, said Mother Kirk, by the power that the landlord has given me.
So you believe in the landlord too, said John.
How can I not, dear, said she, when I am his own daughter-in-law?
Hey,
he does not give you very fine clothes, said John, glancing at the old woman's country cloak.
They'll last my time, said the old woman placidly.
We ought to try her, whispered Virtue to John. As long as there is any chance, we are not allowed to neglect it. But John frowned at him to be silent, and addressed the old woman again. Do you not think this landlord of yours is a very strange one? He said.
How so?
Said she. Why does he make a road like this, running up to the very edge of a precipice? Unless it is to encourage travellers to break their necks in the dark.
Oh, bless you, he never left it like that, said the old woman. It was a good road all round the world when it was new, and all this gorge is far later than the road.
You mean, said Virtue, that there has been some sort of catastrophe?
Well, said Mother Kirk, I see there will be no getting you down tonight, so I may as well tell you the story. Come and sit down by me. You are neither of you so wise that you need be ashamed of listening to an old wives' tale.
2. Mother Kirk's Story. When they were seated, the old woman told the following story.
You must know that once upon a time there were no tenants in this country at all, for the landlord used to farm it himself. There were only the animals, and the landlord used to look after them, he and his sons and daughters. Every morning they used to come down from the mountains and milk the cows and lead out the sheep to pasture. And they needed less watching, for all the animals were tamer then, and there were no fences needed, for if a wolf got in among the flocks, he would do them no harm.
And one day the landlord was going home from his day's work when he looked round on the country and the beasts and saw how the crops were springing, and it came into his head that the whole thing was too good to keep to himself. So he decided to let the country to tenants, and his first tenant was a young married man. But first the landlord made a farm in the very centre of the land where the soil was the best and the air most wholesome, and that was the very spot where you are sitting now. They were to have the whole land, but that was too much for them to keep under cultivation. The landlord's idea was that they could work the farm and leave the rest as a park for the time being. But later they could divide the park up into holdings for their children, for you must know that he drew up a very different lease from the kind you have nowadays. It was a lease in perpetuity on his side, for he promised never to turn them out. But on their side they could leave when they chose, as long as one of their sons was there to take the farm on, and then they could go up to live with him in the mountains. He thought that would be a good thing, because it would broaden the minds of his own mountain children to mix with strangers, and they thought so too. But before he put the tenants in possession, there was one thing he had to do. Up to this time the country had been full of a certain fruit which the landlord had planted for the refreshment of himself and his children, if they were thirsty during the day as they worked down here. It was a very good fruit, and up in the mountains they say it is even more plentiful. But it is very strong, and only those who are mountain-bred ought to eat it, for only they can digest it properly. Hitherto, while there were only beasts in the land, it had done no harm for these mountain apples to be growing in every thicket, for you know that an animal will eat nothing but what is good for it. But now that there were to be men in the land, the landlord was afraid that they might do themselves an injury. Yet it was not to be thought of that he should dig up every sapling of that tree and make the country into a desert. So he decided that it was best to be frank with the young people, and when he found a great big mountain apple tree growing in the very centre of the farm, he said, "So much the better. If they are to learn sense, they may as well learn it from the beginning, and if they will not, there's no help for it. For if they did not find mountain apples on the farm, they would soon find them somewhere else." So he left the apple tree standing and put the man and his wife into their farm. But before he left them, he explained the whole affair to them, as much of it could be explained, and warned them on no account to eat any of the apples. Then he went home, and for a time the young man and his wife behaved very well, tending the animals and managing their farm and abstaining from the mountain apples. And for all I know, they might never have done otherwise if the wife had not somehow made a new acquaintance. This new acquaintance was a landowner himself. He had been born in the mountains and was one of our landlord's own children, but he had quarrelled with his father and set up on his own, and now had built up a very considerable estate in another country. His estate marches, however, with this country, and as he was a great land grabber, he always wanted to take this bit in, and he has very nearly succeeded. "I've never met any tenants of his," said John. "Not tenants in chief, my dear," said the old woman, "and so you didn't know them. But you may have met the Clevers, who are tenants of Mr. Mammon, and he is a tenant of the Spirit of the Age, who holds directly of the enemy." "I am sure the Clevers would be very surprised," said John, "to hear that they had a landlord at all. They would think this enemy, as you call him, no less a superstition than your landlord." "But this is how business is managed," said Mother Kirk. "The little people do not know the big people to whom they belong. The big people do not intend that they should. No important transference of property could be carried out if all the small people at the bottom knew what was really happening. But this is not part of my story. As I was saying, the enemy got to know the farmer's wife, and however he did it, or whatever he said to her, it wasn't long before he persuaded her that the one thing she needed was a nice mountain apple, and she took one and ate it. And then, you know how it is with husbands, she made the farmer come round to her mind, and at the moment he put out his hand and plucked the fruit, there was an earthquake, and the country cracked open all the way across from north to south, and ever since, instead of the farm, there has been this gorge, which the country people call the Grand Canyon, but in my language its name is Peccatum Ade." 3.
the self-sufficiency of virtue. And I suppose, said John sourly, the landlord was so annoyed that it was he who invented the rules and the black hole. The story is not quite so simple as that, said the old woman. So many things happened after the eating of the apple. For one thing, the taste created such a craving in the man and the woman that they thought they could never eat enough of it. And they were not content with all the wild apple trees, but planted more and more, and grafted mountain apple onto every other kind of tree, so that every fruit should have a dash of that taste in it. They succeeded so well that the whole vegetable system of the country is now infected, and there is hardly a fruit or a root in the land, certainly none this side of the canyon, that has not a little mountain apple in it. You have never tasted anything that was quite free from it. And what has that got to do with the card of rules? Said John. Everything, said Mother Kirk. In a country where all the food is more or less poisoned, but some of it very much less than more, you need very complicated rules indeed to keep healthy. Meanwhile, said Virtue, we are not getting on with our journey. I will carry you down in the morning, if you like, said Mother Kirk. Only mind you, it is a dangerous place, and you must do exactly as I tell you. If the place is so dangerous, began John, when Virtue, who had been struck by the woman's last words, suddenly broke in. I'm afraid it is no use, Mother, he said. I cannot put myself under anyone's orders. I must be the captain of my soul and the master of my fate, but thank you for your offer. You are right, said John hastily, and added in a whisper, the old creature is clearly insane. Our real business is to explore this chasm north and south until we find some place where the descent is practicable. Virtue had risen. We are thinking, Mother, he said, that we should like to make sure for ourselves that there is no place where we cannot get down without being carried. You see, my own legs have served me so far, and I should not like to start being carried now. It will do you no harm to try, answered Mother Kirk, and I should not wonder if you find a way down. Getting up the other side is another question, to be sure, but perhaps we shall meet again when it comes to that. By this time it was quite dark. The two young men bade good night to the woman and drew back along the main road to discuss their plans. Two by-roads branched off from it about a quarter of a mile from the precipice, and as that which went to the north seemed rather the better, and also pointed a little backward and away from the cliffs, which John was anxious not to skirt in the darkness, they turned northward. It was a fine starlit night, and grew colder as they proceeded. 4. Mr. Sensible. When they had walked rather more than a mile, John drew Virtue's attention to a light a little back from the road, and I saw them follow it till they came to a gateway, and after that to a door, and there they knocked. Whose house is this? Said Virtue, when the servant opened to them. This is Mr. Sensible's house, said the servant, and if you are benighted travellers, he will receive you gladly. Then he brought them into a room, where a lamp was burning clearly, but not very brightly, and an old gentleman was seated by a blazing wood fire with his dog at his feet, and his book on his knees, and a jigsaw puzzle at one side of him spread out on a wooden frame, and on the other a chessboard with the pieces set for a problem. He rose to greet them very cordially, but not hastily. You are very welcome, gentlemen, said Mr. Sensible. Pray come and warm yourselves. Drudge, and here he called to the servant, make some supper ready for 3. The usual supper, Drudge. I shall not be able to offer you luxury, gentlemen. The wine of my own country, cowslip wine, shall be your drink. It will be rough to your palates, but to mine the draught that I owe to my own garden and my own kitchen will always have a flavour beyond hippocrene. The radishes also of my own growing, I think I may venture to praise. But I see by your looks that I have already betrayed my foible. I confess that my garden is my pride. But what then? We are all children, and I reckon him the wisest among us that can make most sport out of the toys suitable to that condition, without seeking to go beyond it. Regum equabit opes animis. Contentment, my friends, contentment is the best riches. Do not let the dog tease you, sir, he has mange. Down, Rover. Alas, Rover, thou little knowest that sentence is passed upon thee. You are surely not going to destroy him, sir, said John. He begins to ail,
said Mr. Sensible, and it would be foolish to keep him longer. What would you? Omnes eodem cogimur. He has lain in the sun and hunted fleas enough, and now, poor fellow, he must go quo dives tullus et ancus. We must take life on the terms it is given us. You will miss your old companion. Why, as to that, you know, the great art of life is to moderate our passions. Objects of affection are like other belongings. We must love them enough to enrich our lives while we have them, not enough to impoverish our lives when they are gone. You see this puzzle here? While I am engaged on it, it seems to me of sovereign importance to fit the pieces together. When it is done, I think of it no more, and if I should fail to do it, why, I would not break my heart. Confound that drudge. Hi, whoreson, are we to wait all night for our supper? Coming, sir, said Drudge from the kitchen. I think the fellow goes to sleep over his pots and pans, said Mr. Sensible. But let us occupy the time by continuing our conversation. Good conversation, I reckon, among the finer sweets of life, but I would not include diatribe or lecturing or persistent discussion under that head. Your doctrinaire is the bane of all talk. As I sit here, listening to your opinions, nullius addictus, and following the ball where it rolls, I defy system. I love to explore your minds en déshabille. Nothing comes amiss. J'aime le jeu, la mort, les livres, la musique, la ville et la champagne. Enfin, tout. Chance is, after all, our best guide. Need I call a better witness than the fortunate cast of the dice which has brought you beneath my roof tonight? It wasn't exactly chance, said Virtue, who had been restlessly waiting to speak. We are on a journey, and we're looking for a way to cross the Grand Canyon. Haud equidem invideo, said the old gentleman. You do not insist on my accompanying you? We hadn't thought of it, said John. Why, then I am very willing that you should go, cried Mr. Sensible, with a burst of melodious laughter. And yet to what end? I often amuse myself with speculating on that curious restlessness in the mind which drives us, especially in youth, to climb up a mountain merely in order that we may then climb down, or to cross the seas in order that we may pay an innkeeper for setting before us worse cheer than we might eat in our own house. Caelum non animum mutamus. Not that I would repress the impulse, you understand, any more than I would starve any other part of my nature. Here again the secret of happiness lies in knowing where to stop. A moderate allowance of travelling, enough to quiet, without satiating, a liberal curiosity is very well. One brings back a few rarities to store in one's inner cabinet against a dull day. But the Grand Canyon, surely a modest tour along the cliffs on this side of it would give you much the same sort of scenery and save your necks. It wasn't scenery we were looking for, said John. I am trying to find the island in the west. You refer, no doubt, to some aesthetic experience. There again, I would not urge a young man to shut his eyes to that sort of thing. Who has not felt immortal longings at the lengthening of the shadow or the turning of the leaf? Who has not stretched out his hands for the ulterior shore, et ego in Arcadia? We have all been fools once, aye, and are glad to have been fools too, but our imaginations, like our appetites, need discipline, not, heaven help us, in the interest of any transcendental ethic, but in the interests of our own solid good. That wild impulse must be tasted, not obeyed. The bees have stings, but we rob them of their honey. To hold all that urgent sweetness to our lips in the cup of one perfect moment, missing no faintest ingredient in the flavour of its monochronos hedone, yet ourselves, in a sense, unmoved. This is the true art. This tames in the service of the reasonable life even those pleasures whose loss might seem to be the heaviest, yet necessary price we paid for rationality. Is it an audacity to hint that for the corrected palate the taste of the draught even owes its last sweetness to the knowledge that we have wrested it from an unwilling source?
to cut off pleasures from the consequences and conditions which they have by nature, detaching, as it were, the precious phrase from its irrelevant context, is what distinguishes the man from the brute and the citizen from the savage. I cannot join with those moralists who inveigh against the Roman emetics in their banquets, still less with those who would forbid the even more beneficent contraceptive devices of our later times. That man who can eat as taste, not nature, prompts him, and yet fear no aching belly, or who can indulge in Venus and fear no impertinent bastard, is a civilized man. In him I recognize urbanity, the note of the centre. "Do you know of any way across the canyon?" said Virtue abruptly. "I do not," said their host, "for I have never made inquiries. The proper study of mankind is man, and I have always left useless speculations alone. Suppose that there were a way across, to what purpose should I use it? Why should I scramble down this side and up the other to find, after my labours, the same soil still beneath me and the same heaven above? It would be laughable to suppose that the country beyond the gorge can be any different from the country on this side of it. Iadem sunt omnia semper. Nature had already done all she can for our comfort and amusement, and the man who does not find content at home will seek it vainly abroad. Confound that fellow. Drudge! Will you bring us our supper, or do you prefer to have every bone in your body broken?" "Coming, sir," said Drudge from the kitchen. "There might be different people on the other side of the canyon," suggested John in the momentary pause that followed. "That is even less likely," said Mr. Sensible. "Human nature is always the same. The dress and the manners may vary, but I detect the unchanging heart beneath the shifting disguises. If there are men beyond the canyon, rest assured that we know them already. They are born and they die, and in the interval between they are the same lovable rascals that we know at home." "Still," said John, "you can't really be certain that there is no such place as my island. Reason left it an open question." "Reason?" exclaimed Mr. Sensible. "Do you mean the mad woman who goes riding about the country dressed up in armour? I trust that when I spoke of the reasonable life, you did not think that I meant anything under her auspices. There is a strange confusion in our language here, for the reasonableness which I commend has no more dangerous enemy than reason. Perhaps I should drop the use of the name altogether and say that my deity is not reason, but le bon sens." "What is the difference?" said Virtue. "Sense is easy. Reason is hard. Sense knows where to stop with gracious inconsistency, while reason slavishly follows an abstract logic whither she knows not. The one seeks comfort and finds it, the other seeks truth and is still seeking. Le bon sens is the father of a flourishing family. Reason is barren and a virgin. If I had my way, I should clap this reason of yours in the bridewell to pursue her meditations in the straw. The baggage has a pretty face, I allow, but she leads us from our true aim, joy, pleasure, ease, content, whate'er the name. She is a fanatic who has never learned from my master to pursue the golden mean, and being a mortal, to think mortal thoughts. Aureum quis. "It is very odd that you should say that," interrupted Virtue, "for I also was brought up on Aristotle. But I think my text must have differed from yours. In mine the doctrine of the means does not bear the sense you have given it at all. He specially says that there is no excess of goodness. You cannot go too far in the right direction. The line that we should follow may start from a middle point in the base of a triangle, but the further off the apex is, the better. In that dimension—" "Do manus," broke out Mr. Sensible. "Spare us the rest, young man. We are not at a lecture, and I readily admit that your scholarship is more recent than mine. Philosophy should be our mistress, not our master, and the pursuit of a pedantic accuracy amidst the freedom of our social pleasures is as unwelcome as—" "And the bit about thinking mortal thoughts," continued Virtue, whose social experience, as I dreamed, was not extensive. "The bit about mortal thoughts was quoted by Aristotle to say that he disagreed with it. He held that the end of mortal life was to put on immortality as much as might be, and he also said that the most useless of studies was the noblest." "I see you are letter perfect, young man," said Mr. Sensible, with a rather chilly smile. "And I am sure these pieces of information, if repeated to your teachers, would win the applause they deserve. Here, if you will forgive me, they are a little out of place." A gentleman's knowledge of the ancient authors is not that of a pedant, and I think you have misunderstood the place which philosophy ought to hold in the reasonable life. We do not memorize systems. What system can stand? What system does not leave us with the old refrain, que sais-je? It is in her power to remind us of the strangeness of things, in the brown charm of her secluded meditations, above all in her decorative function, that philosophy becomes instrumental to the good life. We go to the porch and the academy to be spectators, not partisans. Drudge! Dinner is served, sir, said Drudge, appearing at the door. Then I dreamed that they went into the dining room, and so to table. 5. Table talk. The cowslip wine came with the oysters. It was a little rough, as the old gentleman had prophesied, and the glasses were so very small that virtue drained his at once. John was afraid that there might be no more to come, and therefore dallied over his, partly because he feared that he might put his host out of countenance, and partly because he disliked the taste. But his precautions were needless, for with the soup came sherry. "Dabibus mensas honorabat inemptus," said Mr. Sensible. "I hope that this wild garden vintage is not unpleasing to an unspoiled palate." "You don't mean to say that you have vines?" exclaimed John. "I was referring to the cowslip wine," said Mr. Sensible. "I hope to have some good vines soon, but at present I still rely a little on my neighbours. Is this our own sherry, Drudge?" "No, sir," said Drudge. "This is that lot that Mr. Broad sent." "Halibut," said John. "You surely don't—" "No," said Mr. Sensible. "Sea fish, I confess, I must get from my friends on the coast." As the meal went on, John's good manners forbade him to make further inquiries, and when a salad came with 1 or 2 very small radishes in it, he was positively relieved that his host should be able to claim them as his own produce. "Is humble sauce a radish or an egg?" said Mr. Sensible. But in my dream I was privileged to know the sources of the whole meal. The cowslip wine and the radishes were home-grown. The joint had been a present from Mr. Mammon. The entrees and savouries came from Escropolis, the champagne and ices from old Mr. Halfways. Some of the food was part of the stores which Mr. Sensible had taken over when he came to live there, from his predecessors who had occupied this house before him. For on that tableland, and especially to the north of the main road, the air is so light and cold that things keep for a long time. The bread, the salt, and the apples had been left by Epicurus, who was the builder of the house and its first inhabitant. Some very fine hock had belonged to Horace. The claret, and also, as I remember, most of the silver, were Montaigne's. But the port, which was 1 in 1,000 and the best thing on that table, had once belonged to Rabelais, who in his turn had it as a present from old Mother Kirk when they were friends. Then I dreamed that after dinner old Mr. Sensible stood up and made a little speech in Latin, thanking the landlord for all they had received. "What?" said John. "Do you believe in the landlord?" "No part of our nature is to be suppressed," said Mr. Sensible, "least of all a part that has enshrined itself in beautiful traditions. The landlord has his function, like everything else, as one element in the good life." Then presently Mr. Sensible, who was turning very red, fixed his eyes intently on John and repeated, "As one element. As one element." "I see," said John, and there was a long silence. "As well," began Mr. Sensible, with great energy some 10 minutes later, "it is part of good manners. Athanatos men prota theos nomo hos diachaitai tima." "My dear Mr. Virtue, my dear young friend, your glass is quite empty. I mean absolutely empty. Cras ingens iterabimus." There was another and longer pause. John began to wonder whether Mr. Sensible were not asleep, when suddenly Mr. Sensible said with great conviction, "Pelite cras ingens tum tum, nomo hos diachaitai." Then he smiled at them and finally went to sleep, and presently Drudge came in, looking old and thin and dirty in the pale morning light, for I thought that the dawn was just then beginning to show through the chinks of the shutters, to carry his master to bed. Then I saw him come back and lead the guests to their beds, and then the third time I saw him come back into the dining-room and pour out the remains of the claret into a glass and drink it off. Then he stood for a moment or so, blinking his red eyes and rubbing his bony, stubbly chin. At last he yawned and set about tidying the room for breakfast. 6. Drudge. I dreamed that John awoke, feeling cold. The chamber in which he lay was luxuriously furnished, and all the house was silent, so that John thought it would be useless to rise, and he piled all his clothes on him and tried to sleep again. But he only grew colder. Then he said to himself, "Even if there is no chance of breakfast, I may save myself from freezing by walking about." So he rose and huddled on all his clothes and went down into the house, but the fires were not yet lit. Finding the back door open, he went out. It was full morning of a grey, sunless day. There were dark clouds fairly low, and as John came out, one snowflake fell at his feet, but no more. He found that he was in Mr. Sensible's garden, but it was more of a yard than a garden. A high wall ran all about it, and all within the wall was dry brown earth with a few stony paths. Dibbling the earth with his foot, John found that the soil was only half an inch deep. Under it was solid rock. A little way from the house he found Drudge down on his hands and knees, scraping together what seemed to be a little pile of dust, but it was in fact the soil of the garden. The little pile had been got together at the cost of leaving the rock uncovered for a big circle, like a bald patch, all round Drudge. "Good morning, Drudge," said John. "What are you making?"
"Radish beds, sir."
"Your master is a great gardener."
"Talks about it, sir."
"Does he not work in the garden himself?"
"No, sir."
"It is a poor soil here. Does he manage to feed himself on his own produce in a good year?"
"Feeds me on it, sir."
"What does the garden grow, besides radishes?"
"Nothing, sir."
John passed on to the end of the garden and looked over the wall, which was lower here. He drew back with a little start, for he found that he was looking down an abyss. The garden was perched on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Below John's feet, at the bottom of the gorge, lay the forest, and on the opposite side he saw a mixture of wood and cliff. The cliffs were all shaggy with trailing and hanging greenery, and streams, rendered immovable to sight by their distance, came down from the land beyond. Even on that cold morning, the farther side looked richer and warmer than his own. "We must get out of this," said John. At that moment, Drudge called to him.
"I shouldn't lean on that wall, sir," he said. "There's frequent landslides."
"Landslides?"
"Yes, sir. I've rebuilt that wall a dozen times. The house used to be right out there, halfway across the gorge."
"The canyon is getting wider, then?"
"At this point, sir. In Mr. Epicurus's time."
"You have been employed here under other masters, then?"
"Yes, sir. I've seen a good many of them. Whoever has lived here has always needed me. Corregia, they used to call me in the old days, but now they just call me Drudge."
"Tell me about your old masters," said John.
"Mr. Epicurus was the first. Mental case he was, poor gentleman. He had a chronic fear of the black hole, something dreadful. I never had a better employer, though. Nice, kind, quiet-spoken sort of a man. I was very sorry when he went down the cliff."
"Goodness me," exclaimed John. "Do you mean that some of your masters have lost their lives in these landslides?"
"Most of them, sir."
At that moment a leonine roar came from one of the upper windows of the house.
"Drudge! Son of a bitch! Hot water!"
"Coming, sir," said Drudge, rising very deliberately from his knees and giving a finishing pat to his heap of dust.
"I shall be leaving here soon," he continued to John. "I'm thinking of going further north."
"Further north?"
"Yes, sir. There are openings with Mr. Savage up in the mountains. I was wondering if you and Mr. Virtue were going that way." "Drudge!" bellowed Mr. Sensible's voice from the house.
"Coming, sir," said Drudge, beginning to untie 2 pieces of string with which he had confined his trousers beneath his knees.
"So you see, Mr. John, I shall be greatly obliged if you will allow me to travel with you."
"Drudge! Am I to call you again?" shouted Mr. Sensible.
"Coming, sir."
"If you was to agree, I would give Mr. Sensible notice this morning." "We are certainly going north for a bit," said John, "and I should have no objection, provided Mr. Virtue agrees."
"Very kind of you, I am sure, sir,"
said Drudge. Then he turned and walked slowly into the house. 7. The Gaucherie of Virtue. Mr. Sensible was not in good humour when they met at breakfast. "That ungrateful blockhead of a servant of mine is leaving me in the lurch," he said, "and for the next few days we must shift for ourselves. I fear I am a wretched cook. Perhaps, Virtue, you would indulge me so far as to take the cooking on yourself until I get a new man.
I dare say you could enable the three of us to live a very tolerable sort of picnic life for 3 days." The two young men informed him that they were continuing their journey after breakfast. "This," said Mr. Sensible, "is getting really serious. Do you mean to say that you are going to desert me? I am to be reduced to absolute solitude, deprived of the common decencies of life, compelled to spend my day in menial offices? Very well, sir. I am unacquainted with modern manners. No doubt this is the way in which young men return hospitality." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Virtue. "I had not seen it in that light. I will certainly act as your servant for a day or so, if you wish it. I had not understood that it would be such a burden to you to cook for yourself. I don't remember that you said anything about servants when you were outlining the good life last night." "Why, sir," said Mr. Sensible, "when I outline the principles of the steam engine, I do not explicitly state that I expect fire to burn or the laws of gravity to operate. There are certain things that one always takes for granted. When I speak of the art of life, I presuppose the ordinary conditions of life which that art utilizes." "Such as wealth," said Virtue. A competence," said Mr. Sensible. "And health, too," said Virtue. "Moderate health," said Mr. Sensible. "Your art, then," said Virtue, "seems to teach men that the best way of being happy is to enjoy unbroken good fortune in every respect. They would not all find the advice helpful. And now, if Drudge will show me his scullery, I will wash up the breakfast things." "You may save yourself the trouble, sir," said Mr. Sensible dryly. "I cannot pretend to your intensity, and I do not choose to be lectured at the breakfast table. When you have mixed more with the world, you will learn not to turn the social board into a schoolroom. In the meantime, forgive me if I feel that I should find your continued society a little fatiguing. Conversation should be like the bee which darts to the next flower before the last has ceased swaying from its area visit. You make it more like a wood beetle eating its way through a table." "As you wish," said Virtue. "But how will you do?" "I shall shut up the house," said Mr. Sensible, "and practice autarkia in a hotel until I have fitted this place up with such mechanical devices as will henceforth render me wholly independent. I see that I have let myself get behind the times. I should have listened more to certain good friends of mine in the city of Claptrap, who have kept abreast of modern invention. They assure me that machinery will soon put the good life beyond the reach of chance, and if mechanism alone will not do it, I know a eugenist who promises to breed us a race of peons who will be psychologically incapable of playing me a trick like this of Drudge's." So it fell out that all four left the house together. Mr. Sensible was astonished to find that Drudge, who parted from his employer very civilly, was accompanying the young man. He only shrugged his shoulders, however, and said, "Vive la bagatelle! You have stayed in my house, which is called Thelema, and its motto is, 'Do what you will.' So many men, so many minds. I hope I can tolerate anything except intolerance." Then he went his way, and they saw him no more. Book 6. Northward Along the Canyon. For being unlike the magnanimous man, they yet ape him, and that in such particulars as they can. Aristotle. Much of the soul they talk, but all awry, and in themselves seek virtue. Milton. I do not admire the excess of some one virtue, unless I am shown at the same time the excess of the opposite virtue. A man does not prove his greatness by standing at an extremity, but by touching both extremities at once, and filling all that lies between them. Pascal. Contempt is a well-recognized defensive reaction. I.A. Richards. 1. First steps to the north. "It is of no use keeping to the road," said Virtue. "We must explore the cliff edge as we go along and make trial descents from point to point." "Begging your pardon, sir," said Drudge. "I know these parts very well, and there is no way down, at least within 30 miles. You'll miss nothing by keeping to the road for today, at any rate." "How do you know?" asked Virtue. "Have you ever tried?" "Oh, bless you, yes," said Drudge. "I've often tried to get across the canyon when I was a youngster." "Clearly we had better follow the road," said John. "I do not feel quite satisfied," said Virtue, "but we can always take the cliffs on the way back. I have an idea that if there is a way down, it will be at the extreme north where this gorge opens on the sea, or failing everything, we might manipulate the mouth of the gorge by boat. In the meantime, I dare say we might do worse than press on by road."
"I quite agree," said John. Then I saw the three set forward on a more desolate march than I had yet beheld. On every side of them the tableland seemed perfectly flat, but their muscles and lungs soon told them that there was a slight but continuous rise. There was little vegetation, here a shrub and there some grass, but the most of it was brown earth and moss and rock, and the road beneath them was stone. The grey sky was never broken, and I do not remember that they saw a single bird, and it was so bleak that if they stopped at any time to rest, the sweat grew cold on them instantly. Virtue never abated his pace, and Drudge kept even with him, though always a respectful yard behind. But I saw that John grew footsore and began to lag. For some hours he was always inventing pretexts to stop, and finally he said, "Friends, it is no use. I can go no further." "But you must," said Virtue.
"The young gentleman is soft, sir, very soft," said Drudge. "He is not used to this sort of thing. We'll have to help him along." So they took him, one by each arm, and helped him along for a few hours. They found nothing to eat or drink in the waste. Towards evening they heard a desolate voice crying, "Maui! Maui!" and looked up, and there was a seagull hanging in the currents of the wind as though it sauntered an invisible stare towards the low rain clouds.
"Good!" cried Virtue. "We are nearing the coast."
"It's a good step yet, sir," said Drudge. "These gulls come 40 miles inland and more in bad weather."
Then they plodded on for many more miles, and the sky began to turn from sunless grey to starless black. And they looked and saw a little shanty by the roadside, and there they knocked on the door. 2. 3 pale men. When they were let in, they found 3 young men, all very thin and pale, seated by a stove under the low roof of the hut. There was some sacking on a bench along one wall, and little comfort else.
"You will fare badly here," said one of the 3 men, "but I am a steward, and it is my duty according to my office to share my supper with you. You may come in."
His name was Mr. Neo-Angular.
"I am sorry that my convictions do not allow me to repeat my friend's offer," said one of the others, "but I have had to abandon the humanitarian and egalitarian fallacies."
His name was Mr. Neo-Classical.
"I hope," said the third, "that your wanderings in lonely places do not mean that you have any of the romantic virus still in your blood."
His name was Mr. Humanist. John was too tired, and Drudge too respectful to reply, but Virtue said to Mr. Neo-Angular,
"You are very kind. You are saving our lives." "I am not kind at all," said Mr. Neo-Angular with some warmth. "I am doing my duty. My ethics are based on dogma, not on feeling." "I understand you very well," said Virtue. "May I shake hands with you?" "Can it be," said the other, "that you are one of us? You are a Catholic, a scholastic?" "Oh, no, nothing about that," said Virtue, "but I know that the rule is to be obeyed, because it is a rule, and not because it appeals to my feelings at the moment." "I see you are not one of us," said Angular, "and you are undoubtedly damned. Virtutes paganorum splendida vitia. Now let us eat."
Then I dreamed that the 3 pale men produced 3 tins of bully beef and 6 biscuits, and Angular shared his with the guests. There was very little for each, and I thought that the best share fell to John and Drudge, for Virtue and the young steward entered into a kind of rivalry who should leave most for the others.
"Our fare is simple," said Mr. Neo-Classical, "and perhaps unwelcome to palates that have been reared on the kickshaw's of lower countries. But you see the perfection of form. This beef is a perfect cube, this biscuit a true square." "You will admit," said Mr. Humanist, "that at least our meal is quite free from any lingering flavour of the old romantic sauces."
"Quite free," said John, staring at the empty tin.
"It's better than radishes, sir," said Drudge. "Do you live here, gentlemen?" said Virtue, when the empty tins had been removed. "We do," said Mr. Humanist. "We are founding a new community. At present we suffer the hardships of pioneers and have to import our food. But when we have brought the country under cultivation, we shall have plenty, as much plenty as is needed for the practice of temperance." "You interest me exceedingly," said Virtue. "What are the principles of this community?" Catholicism, humanism, classicism, said all three.
Catholicism? Then you are all stewards?
Certainly not, said classical and humanist.
At least you all believe in the landlord.
I have no interest in the question, said classical. And I, said humanist, know perfectly well that the landlord is a fable.
And I,
said Angular, know perfectly well that he is a fact.
This is very surprising, said Virtue. I do not see how you have come together, or what your common principles can possibly be.
We are united by a common antagonism to a common enemy, said Humanist. You must understand that we are three brothers, the sons of old Mr. Enlightenment of the town of Claptrap. I know him, said John. Our father was married twice, continued Humanist. Once to a lady named Epicaricacia, and afterwards to Euphuria. By his first wife he had a son called Sigmund, who is thus our step-brother.
I know him too, said John.
We are the children of his second marriage, said Humanist.
Then, cried Virtue, we are related, if you care to acknowledge the kinship. You have probably heard that Euphuria had a child before she married your father. I was that child, though I confess that I never discovered who my father was, and enemies have hinted that I'm a bastard.
You have said quite sufficient, replied Angular. You can hardly expect that the subject should be agreeable to us. I might add that my office, if there were nothing else, sets me apart even from my legitimate relations. And what about the common antagonism? Said John. We were all brought up, said Humanist, by our step-brother in the university at Ascropolis, and we learned there to see that whoever stays with Mr. Halfways must either come on to Ascropolis or else remain at Thrill as the perpetual minion of his brown daughter. You had not been with Mr. Halfways yourselves, then? Asked John. Certainly not. We learned to hate him from watching the effect which his music had on other people. Hatred of him is the first thing that unites us. Next, we discovered how residence in Ascropolis inevitably leads to the giant's dungeon.
I know all about that, too, said John.
Our common hatred therefore links us together against the giant, against Ascropolis, and against Mr. Halfways.
But especially against the latter, said Classical.
I should rather say, remarked Angular, against half-measures and compromises of all sorts, against any pretense that there is any kind of goodness or decency, any even tolerable temporary resting place on this side of the Grand Canyon.
And that, said Classical, is why Angular is for me in one sense the enemy, but in another the friend. I cannot agree with his notions about the other side of the canyon, but just because he relegates his delusions to the other side, he is free to agree with me about this side, and to be an implacable exposer, like myself, of all attempts to foist upon us any transcendental, romantical, optimistic trash.
My own feeling, said Humanist, is rather that Angular is with me in guarding against any confusion of the levels of experience. He canalizes all the mystical nonsense, the Sehnsucht and Wanderlust and Nympholepsy, and transfers them to the far side. That prevents their drifting about on this side and hindering our real function. It leaves us free to establish a really tolerable and even comfortable civilization here on the plateau, a culture based alike on those truths which Mr. Sensible acknowledges and on those which the giant reveals, but throwing over both alike a graceful veil of illusion. And that way we shall remain human. We shall not become beasts with the giant, nor abortive angels with Mr. Halfways.
The young gentleman is asleep, sir, said Drudge.
And indeed John had sunk down some time ago.
You must excuse him, said Virtue. He found the road long today.
Then I saw that all 6 men lay down together in the sacking. The night was far colder than the night they passed in Mr. Sensible's house. But as there was here no pretence of comfort, and they lay huddled together in the narrow hut, John slept warmer here than at Thelema. 3. Neo-Angular. When they rose in the morning, John was so footsore and his limbs ached so that he knew not how to continue his journey. Drudge assured them that the coast could not now be very far. He thought that Virtue could reach it and return in a day, and that John might await him in the hut.
As for John himself, he was loath to burden hosts who lived in such apparent poverty. But Mr. Angular constrained him to stay, when he had explained that the secular virtue of hospitality was worthless, and care for the afflicted a sin, if it proceeded from humanitarian sentiment, but that he was obliged to act as he did by the rules of his order. So in my dream I saw Drudge and Virtue set out northwards alone, while John remained with the 3 pale men. In the forenoon he had a conversation with Angular. "You believe, then," said John, "that there is a way across the canyon?" "I know there is. If you will let me take you to Mother Kirk, she will carry you over in a moment. And yet I'm not sure that I'm not sailing under false colors. When I set out from home, crossing the canyon was never in my thoughts, still less was Mother Kirk." "It does not matter in the least what was in your thoughts." "It does to me. You see, my only motive for crossing is the hope that something I'm looking for may be on the other side." "That is a dangerous, subjective motive. What is this something?" "I saw an island." "Then you must forget it as soon as you can. Islands are the Hathaway's concern. I assure you, you must eradicate every trace of that nonsense from your mind before I can help you." "But how can you help me after removing the only thing that I want to be helped to? What is the use of telling a hungry man that you will grant him his desires, provided there is no question of eating? If you do not want to cross the canyon, there is no more to be said. But then you must realize where you are. Go on with your island, if you like, but do not pretend that it is anything but a part of the land of destruction this side of the canyon. If you are a sinner, for heaven's sake have the grace to be a cynic, too." "But how can you say that the island is all bad, when it is longing for the island and nothing else that has brought me this far?" "It makes no difference. All on this side of the canyon is much of a muchness. If you confine yourself to this side, then the spirit of the age is right." "But this is not what Mother Kirk said. She particularly insisted that some of the food was much less poisonous than the rest." "So you have met Mother Kirk. No wonder that you are confused. You had no business to talk to her except through a qualified steward. Depend upon it, you have misunderstood every word she said." "Then there was reason, too. She refused to say that the island was an illusion. But perhaps, like Mr. Sensible, you have quarreled with reason." "Reason is divine. But how should you understand her? You are a beginner. For you, the only safe commerce with reason is to learn from your superiors the dogmata in which her deliverances have been codified for general use." "Look here," said John, "have you ever seen my island?" "God forbid." "And you have never heard Mr. Halfway's either?" "Never, and I never will. Do you take me for an escapist?" "Then there is at least one object in the world of which I know more than you. I tasted what you call romantic trash. You have only talked about it. You need not tell me that there is a danger in it, and an element of evil. Do you suppose that I have not felt that danger and that evil 1,000 times more than you? But I know also that the evil in it is not what I went to it to find, and that I should have sought nothing and found nothing without it. I know this by experience, as I know a dozen things about it, which of you betray your ignorance as often as you speak. Forgive me, I am rude. But how is it possible that you can advise me in this matter? Would you recommend a eunuch as confessor to a man whose difficulties lay in the realm of chastity? Would a man born blind be my best guide against the lust of the eye? But I am getting angry, and you have shared your biscuit with me. I ask your pardon." "It is part of my office to bear insults with patience," said Mr. Angular. 4. Humanist. In the afternoon, Mr. Humanist took John out to show him the garden, by whose produce, in time, the new culture was to become self-supporting. As there was no human or indeed animal habitation within sight, no wall or fence had been deemed necessary, but the area of the garden had been marked up by a line of stones and seashells alternately arranged. And this was necessary, as the garden would else have been indistinguishable from the waste. A few paths, also marked by stones and shells, were arranged in a geometrical pattern. "You see," said Mr. Humanist, "we have quite abandoned the ideas of the old romantic landscape gardeners. You notice a certain severity. A landscape gardener would have had a nodding grove over there on the right, and a mound on the left, and winding paths, and a pond, and flower beds. He would have filled the obscurer parts with the means of sensuality, the formless potato, and the romantically irregular cabbage. You see, there is nothing of the sort here."
Nothing at all, said John. At present, of course, it is not very fruitful, but we are pioneers. Do you ever try digging it? Suggested John. Why, no, said Mr. Humanist. You see, it is pure rock an inch below the surface, so we do not disturb the soil. That would remove the graceful veil of illusion which is so necessary to the human point of view. 5. Food from the north. Late that evening the door of the hut opened and Virtue staggered in and dropped to a sitting position by the stove. He was very exhausted, and it was long before he had his breath to talk. When he had, his first words were, "You must leave this place, gentlemen. It is in danger." "Where is Drudge?" said John. "He stayed there." "And what is this danger?" asked Mr. Humanist. "I'm going to tell you. By the by, there's no way over the gorge northward." "We have been on a fool's errand, then," said John, "ever since we left the main road." "Except that now we know," replied Virtue. "But I must eat before I can tell my story. Tonight I'm able to return our friend's hospitality." And with that he produced from various parts of his clothing the remains of a handsome cold pie, 2 bottles of strong beer, and a little flask of rum. For some time there was silence in the hut, and when the meal was finished and a little water had been boiled, so that each had a glass of hot grog, Virtue began his story. 6. Furthest north. "It is all like this as far as the mountains, about 15 miles, and there is nothing to tell of our journey except rock and moss and a few gulls. The mountains are frightful as you approach them, but the road runs up to a pass, and we had not much difficulty. Beyond the pass you get into a little rocky valley, and it was here that we first found any signs of habitation. The valley is a regular warren of caves inhabited by dwarfs. There are several species of them, I gather, though I only distinguish 2. A black kind with black shirts and a red kind who call themselves Marks-a-Many. They're all very fierce and apparently quarrel a good deal, but they all acknowledge some kind of vassalage to this man Savage. At least they made no difficulty in letting me through when they heard that I wanted to see him, beyond insisting on giving me a guard. It was there I lost Drudge. He said he had come to join the Red Dwarfs and would I mind going on alone. He was just the same up to the end, civil as ever, but he was down one of their burrows, and apparently quite at home before I could get in a word. Then my dwarfs took me on. I didn't care for the arrangements much. They were not men, you know, not dwarf men, but red dwarfs, trolls. They could talk, and they walk on 2 legs, but the structure must be quite different from ours. I felt all the time that if they killed me it wouldn't be murder, any more than if a crocodile or a gorilla killed me. It is a different species, however it came there. Different faces. Well, they kept taking me up and up. It was all rocky zigzags, round and round. Fortunately, I did not get giddy. My chief danger was the wind whenever we got on a ridge, for of course my guides, being only some 3 feet high, did not offer it the same target. I had 1 or 2 narrow escapes. Savage's Nest is a terrifying place. It is a long hall like a barn, and when I first caught sight of it, halfway up the sky from where they were leading me, I thought to myself that wherever else we were going it could not be there. It looked so inaccessible, but on we went. One thing you must get into your heads is that there are caves all the way up, all inhabited. The whole mountain must be honeycombed. I saw thousands of dwarfs, like an anthill, and not a man in the place except me. From Savage's Nest you look straight down to the sea. I should think it is the biggest sheer drop on any coast. It was from there that I saw the mouth of the gorge. The mouth is only a lowering of the cliff. From the lowest part of the opening it is still thousands of feet to the sea. There is no conceivable landing. It is no use to anyone but seagulls. But you want to hear about Savage. He sat on a high chair at the end of his barn, a very big man, almost a giant. When I say that, I don't mean his height. I had the same feeling about him that I had about the dwarves, that doubt about the species. He was dressed in skins and had an iron helmet on his head with horns stuck in it. He had a woman there too, a great big woman with yellow hair and high cheekbones. Grimhild her name is. And the funny thing is that she is the sister of an old friend of yours, John. She is Mr. Halfway's elder daughter. Apparently Savage came down to Thrill and carried her off. And what is stranger still, both the girl and the old gentleman were rather pleased about it than otherwise. As soon as the dwarfs brought me in, Savage rapped on the table and bellowed out, "Lay the board for us men," and she set about laying it.
He didn't say anything to me for a long time. He just sat and looked and sang. He had only one song, and he was singing it off and on all the time I was there. I remember bits of it. Wind age, wolf age, ere the world crumbles, shard age, spear age, shields are broken. Then there was another bit, began, East sits the olden in iron forest, feeds amidst it Fenris children. I sat down after a bit, for I did not want him to think I was afraid of him. When the food was on the table, he asked me to have some, so I had it. He offered me a sweet drink, very strong in a horn, so I drank it. Then he shouted and drank himself, and said that mead in a horn was all he could offer me at present. But soon, he said, I shall drink the blood of men from skulls. There was a lot of this sort of stuff. We ate roast pork with our fingers. He kept on singing his song and shouting. It was only after dinner that he began to talk connectedly. I wish I could remember it all. This is the important part of my story. It is hard to understand it without being a biologist. These dwarves are a different species, and an older species than ours. But then the specific variation is always liable to reappear in human children. They revert to the dwarf. Consequently, they are multiplying very fast. They are being increased both by ordinary breeding among themselves and also from without by those harkbacks or changelings. He spoke of lots of subspecies besides the Marxamani, Mussolimini, Swastici, Gangamani. I can't remember them all. For a long time I couldn't see where he himself came in. At last he told me. He is breeding and training them for a descent on this country. When I tried to find out why, for a long time he would only stare at me and sing his song. Finally, as near as I could get it, his theory seemed to be that fighting was an end in itself. Mind you, he was not drunk. He said that he could understand old-fashioned people who believed in the landlord and kept the rules and hoped to go up and live in the landlord's castle when they had to leave this country. They have something to live for, he said, and if their belief was true, their behaviour would be perfectly sensible. But as their belief is not true, there remains only one way of life fit for a man. This other way of life was something he called heroism, or master morality, or violence. All the other people in between, he said, are ploughing the sand. He went on railing at the people in Claptrap for ages, and also at Mr. Sensible. These are the dregs of man, he said. They are always thinking of happiness. They are scraping together and storing up and trying to build. Can they not see that the law of the world is against them? Where will any of them be 100 years hence? I said they might be building for posterity. And who will posterity build for? He asked. Can't you see that it is all bound to come to nothing in the end? And the end may come tomorrow. And however late it comes, to those who look back, all their happiness will seem but a moment that has slipped away and left nothing behind. You can't gather happiness. Do you go to bed with any more in hand on the day you have had 1,000 pleasures? I asked if his heroism left anything behind it either. He said it did. The excellent deed, he said, is eternal. The hero alone has this privilege, that death for him is not defeat, and the lamenting over him and the memory is part of the good he aimed for, and the moment of battle fears nothing from the future because it has already cast security away. He talked a lot like that. I asked him what he thought of the Escropolitans, and he roared with laughter and said, when the cruels meet the clevers, there will not be even the ghost of a tug of war. Then I asked him if he knew you three, and he laughed louder still. He said that Angula might turn out an enemy worth fighting when he grew up. But I don't know, he said. Likely enough, he is only an Escropolitan turned inside out, poacher turned gamekeeper. As for the other pair, they're the last even of the last men. I asked him what he meant. The men of Claptrap, he said, may have some excuse for their folly, for they at least still believe that your country is a place where happiness is possible. But your two friends are madmen without qualification. They claim to have reached rock bottom. They talk of being disillusioned. They think that they have reached the furthest north, as if I were not here to the north of them. They live on a rock that will never feed man, between a chasm that they cannot cross and the home of a giant to whom they dare not return, and still they maunder of a culture and a security. If all men who try to build are but polishing the brasses on a sinking ship, then your pale friends are the supreme fools who polish with the rest, though they know and admit that the ship is sinking. Their humanism and what not is but the old dream with a new name. The rot in the world is too deep, and the leak in the world is too wide. They may patch and tinker as they please, they will not save it. Better give in. Better cut the wood with the grain. If I am to live in a world of destruction, let me be its agent and not its patient. In the end, he said, I will make this concession to your friends. They do live further north than anyone but me. They are more like men than any of their race. They shall have this honour when I lead the dwarfs to war, that humanists' skulls shall be the first from which I drink the blood of a man, and Grimhild here shall have classicals. That was about all he said. He made me go out on the cliffs with him. It was all I could do to keep my footing. He said, this wind blows straight from the pole. It will make a man of you. I think he was trying to frighten me. In the end, I got away. He loaded me with food for myself and you. Feed them up, he said. There is not enough blood in them at present to quench the thirst of a dwarfish sword. Then I came away, and I am very tired.
7. Fool's Paradise.
I should like to meet this savage, said Angula. He seems to be a very clear-headed man.
I don't know about that, said Humanist. He and his dwarfs seem to me to be just the thing I am fighting against. The logical conclusion of Escropolis against which I raised the banner of humanism. All the wild atavistic emotions which old Halfways sets free under false pretences. I'm not at all surprised that he likes a Valkyrie for a daughter, and which young Halfways unmasks, but cherishes when he has unmasked them. Where can they end but in a complete abandonment of the human? I am glad to hear of him. He shows how necessary I am. I agree, said John in great excitement. But how are you going to fight? Where are your troops? Where is your base of supplies? You can't feed an army on a garden of stones and seashells. It is intelligence that counts, said Humanist. It moves nothing, said John. You see that savage is scalding hot, and you are cold. You must get heat to rival his heat. Do you think you can rout 1,000,000 armed dwarves by being not romantic?
If Mr. Virtue will not be offended, said Classical, I would suggest that he dreamed the whole thing. Mr. Virtue is romantic. He is paying for his wish-fulfillment dreams as he will always pay with a fear-fulfillment dream. It is well known that nobody lives further north than we.
But Virtue was too tired to defend his story, and soon all the occupants of the hut were asleep. Book 7. Southward along the canyon. Now is the 7th winter since Troy fell, and we still search beneath unfriendly stars through every sea and desert isle for Italy's retreating strand. But here is kinsman's country and Acestes' land. What hinders here to build a city and remain? O fatherland, O household spirits preserved in vain from the enemy, shall no new Troy arise? Shall no new Simois there, renamed for Hector's memory, flow? Rather, come, burn with me the boats that work us harm. Virgil. Through this and through no other fault we fell, nor being fallen bear other pain than this, always without hope in desire to dwell. Dante. Some also have wished that the next way to their father's house were here, that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over. But the way is the way, and there's an end. Bunyan. 1. Virtue is sick. I saw the two travellers get out from their sacking and bid goodbye to their hosts and set out southwards. The weather had not changed, nor did I ever see any other weather over that part of the country than clouds and wind without rain. Virtue himself was out of sorts, and made haste without the spirit of haste. Then at last he opened his mind to his companion, and said, John, I do not know what is coming over me. Long ago you asked me, or was it Media asked me, where I was going and why, and I remember that I brushed the question aside. At that time it seemed to me so much more important to keep my rules and do my 30 miles a day, but I'm beginning to find that it will not do. In the old days it was always a question of doing what I chose instead of what I wanted, but now I'm beginning to be uncertain what it is I choose. How has this come about? Said John. Do you know that I nearly decided to stay with Savage? With Savage? It sounds like raving, but think it over. Supposing there is no landlord, no mountains in the east, no island in the west, nothing but this country. A few weeks ago I would have said that all those things made no difference. But now I don't know. It is quite clear that all the ordinary ways of living in this country lead to something which I certainly do not choose. I know that, even if I don't know what I do choose. I know that I don't want to be a halfways, or a clever, or a sensible.
Then there is the life I've been leading myself, marching on I don't know where. I can't see that there is any other good in it except the mere fact of imposing my will on my inclinations, and that seems to be good training. But training for what? Suppose, after all, it was training for battle. Is it so absurd to think that that might be the thing we were born for? A fight in a narrow place, life or death? That must be the final act of will, the conquest of the deepest inclination of all. "I think my heart will break," said John after they had gone many paces in silence. "I came out to find my island. I'm not high-minded like you, Virtue. It was never anything but sweet desire that led me. I have not smelled the air from that island since... It is so long that I cannot remember. I saw more of it at home, and now my only friend talks of selling himself to the dwarfs." "I'm sorry for you," said Virtue, "and I am sorry for myself. I am sorry for every blade of grass and for this barren rock we are treading and the very sky above us, but I have no help to give you." "Perhaps," said John, "there are things east and west of this country after all." "Do you still understand me so little as that?" cried Virtue, turning on him. "Things east and west? Don't you see that that is the other fatal possibility? Don't you see that I am caught either way?" "Why?" said John. And then, "Let us sit down. I am tired and we have nowhere to hurry to. Not now." Virtue sat down as one not noticing that he did it. "Don't you see?" he said. "Suppose there is anything east and west. How can that give me a motive for going on? Because there is something dreadful behind? That is a threat. I meant to be a free man. I meant to choose things because I chose to choose them, not because I was paid for it. Do you think I am a child to be scared with rods and baited with sugar plums? It was for this reason that I never even inquired whether the stories about the landlord were true. I saw that his castle and his black hole were there to corrupt my will and kill my freedom. If it was true, it was a truth an honest man must not know." Evening darkened on the tableland, and they sat for a long time, immovable. "I believe that I am mad," said Virtue presently. "The world cannot be as it seems to me. If there is something to go to, it is a bribe, and I cannot go to it. If I can go, then there is nothing to go to." "Virtue," said John, "give in. For once yield to desire. Have done with your choosing. Want something." "I cannot," said Virtue. "I must choose because I choose because I choose."
That's right, dog.
And it goes on forever. And in the whole world I cannot find a reason for rising from this stone. Is it not reason enough that the cold will presently kill us here? It had grown quite dark, and Virtue made no reply. "Virtue," said John, and then suddenly again in a louder voice, frightened, "Virtue!" But there was no answer. He groped for his friend in the dark and touched the cold dust of the tableland. He rose on his hands and knees and groped all about, calling. But he was confused and could not even find again the place whence he had risen himself. He could not tell how often he might have groped over the same ground, or whether he was getting further and further from their resting place. He could not be still. It was too cold. So all that night he rummaged to and fro in the dark, calling out Virtue's name. And often it came into his head that Virtue had been all along one of the phantoms of a dream, and that he had followed a shade. 2.
There's something going on. I'll tell you that. Get it there.